She had walked the edges of other people's good fortune her whole life, close enough to see it clearly, far enough away to know it would never spill over onto her. That was how Marlene Voss had come to understand the world, not as a place of cruelty exactly, but as a place of arrangement, where some things were simply positioned beyond your reach, no matter how long your arms grew or how far you leaned. She had learned this early, the way most people learn things that leave permanent marks, through repetition and small humiliations spaced just far enough apart to keep the lesson fresh. She was 43 years old, though she looked older in certain lights, the kind of tired that sleep could not fully fix, having settled into the corners of her eyes years ago, and stayed there. She lived in the same county where she had been born, in a town called Greer's Hollow, a name that sounded more romantic than anything the place had ever managed to justify. The main road through town passed a feed supply store, a laundromat that had been losing one dryer per year for the past decade, a diner that served good pie and little else worth mentioning, and a post office that shared its building with the county extension office in a marriage of convenience that suited no one completely. Beyond the road, the land spread out in the way that land does in places people have been farming for generations, rolling and patient, marked by fence lines and tree rows and the occasional remnant of something that had once been a plan. Marlene had a daughter named Cass, 15 years old and watchful in the way of children who have grown up knowing that resources are finite. Cass had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubbornness, though her father had been gone for 11 years by then, departed in stages the way some men left, first in spirit and then in body and then, eventually, in any practical sense at all. He had left behind a small amount of debt and a larger amount of silence on the subject, both of which Marlene had absorbed without dramatizing. She had too much else to manage. They lived in a rental house on Cartwright Lane, a narrow place with 3 rooms and a furnace that worked competently in September and lost conviction steadily through January. The landlord, a man named Pruitt who had inherited the property from his own mother, raised the rent every 18 months with the mechanical consistency of someone who had been told this was simply how things were done. Marlene paid what she could and made up the difference with arrangements that changed shape depending on the season. In summer, she took extra shifts at the hospital laundry facility 2 towns over. In winter, she cleaned offices on weekends. She had worked in the diner for 11 years until the owner retired and sold to someone from out of state who brought his own staff and his own ideas about what the menu should look like. She was not a woman who spoke much about her circumstances. She had a particular distaste for the performance of suffering, had seen too many people mistake the telling of their troubles for the solving of them. When Cass asked questions about money, which she did with increasing frequency as she got older and began to understand the geography of the household budget, Marlene answered plainly and without apology. They were not poor, she said. They were careful. The distinction mattered to her even when it was difficult to locate in any practical sense. The call came on a Tuesday in March from a lawyer's office she had never heard of in a county 2 hours south. The lawyer's name was Aldretti, and he spoke with the careful economy of a man who had learned to deliver information without attaching sentiment to it. He told her that her great-uncle, a man named Harlan Voss, had died 6 weeks prior at the age of 91. She had not known he was still alive. She had not, in fact, thought of Harlan Voss in years, had met him perhaps twice in childhood, a tall, quiet man with the kind of stillness around him that either belonged to wisdom or to damage and was difficult to distinguish between. He had never married. He had lived on his land for 60 years without much interference from anyone, which, in retrospect, she supposed, was a form of accomplishment. The estate, Aldretti explained, had been distributed according to Harlan's will. The primary holdings, the farmhouse, the equipment, the productive land, the savings account that amounted to a modest sum, had gone to Harlan's neighbor and longtime friend, a man named Cecil Gratch, who had apparently helped Harlan manage the property in his later years. Marlene listened to this without surprise. She had not known about the will, had not been expecting anything, had not even been certain Harlan knew she existed with any specificity. She began to understand that the call was something in the nature of a courtesy, a box being checked. Then Aldretti said the word Fencerow. She was left, he explained, the eastern Fencerow of the Voss property. 214 yards of boundary line, running from the old county road to the wood line at the back of the acreage. It had been designated in the will with its own paragraph, which was unusual, already noted, for a piece of land with no assessed value and no productive use. The Fencerow was not farmable. It was too narrow, too overgrown, and bisected by a drainage easement that had been mapped sometime in the 1940s and subsequently forgotten by everyone except, apparently, Harlan. There were no structures on it, no minerals rights attached, no timber of commercial value. It was, in the county assessor's language, a strip of transitional vegetation maintained as boundary demarcation. Marlene sat at her kitchen table after the call ended and looked at her coffee going cold in its cup. Cass was at school. The furnace ticked in the way it did when the temperature outside dropped below freezing, a small rhythmic complaint that she had long since stopped hearing consciously. She turned the word over in her mind. Fencerow. She had grown up around fence rows, had walked along them picking blackberries in August, had helped stretch wire along them one summer when she was 12 and a neighbor needed an extra pair of hands. A fencerow was a boundary. It was the line between what was yours and what was someone else's. It was where the land paused before deciding what it was. She told Cass that evening at dinner. She kept the explanation simple, partly because she did not fully understand it herself, and partly because she had learned that the most accurate way to describe an uncertain thing was to describe it exactly as it stood, without decorating it with hope or dismissal. We inherited a fence. Row, she said. Cass looked up from her plate. What does that mean? It means a strip of land along a fence line. 200 and some yards of it. What's on it? Marlene thought for a moment. Grass, she said. Old fence posts. Probably some brush. Maybe some trees along the edges. Cass considered this with the expression she used when filing information into uncertain categories. Is that good? I don't know yet, Marlene said. She meant that honestly. She did not know. She had spent enough of her life making judgments about things before she understood them to have developed a preference for waiting. The fencerow would tell her what it was when she looked at it. Until then, she was content to let it remain a fact without an interpretation. The reaction from people who knew her was, in the main, sympathetic in the way that pity dressed itself up as sympathy when the subject was too small to take seriously. Her co-worker at the laundry facility, a woman named Doris who had strong opinions about nearly everything and shared them freely, laughed when Marlene mentioned it. Not cruelly, but with the loose certainty of someone who has already decided what category the thing belongs in. A fencerow, Doris repeated. Honey, that man left you a strip of weeds. Marlene's neighbor on Cartwright Lane, an older man named Prentice who spent his evenings on his porch regardless of weather and considered himself a student of local real estate, looked at her with something between pity and amusement when she told him. That's old Harlan Voss's land, he said. Down past Meacham County? I've heard of that parcel. Nothing down there worth a plug nickel on that boundary line. Harlan was an odd one. Probably just wanted to leave you something without leaving you anything useful. Some people are like that. The woman at the county extension office, when Marlene stopped in to ask about whether the drainage easement had any implications she should understand, did not look up from her computer for most of the conversation. Transitional vegetation zones don't carry any rights worth pursuing, she said, typing as she spoke. The easement supersedes any use rights you'd have on that drainage corridor anyway. You could theoretically fence it, but you'd be fencing someone else's easement access, which would create liability. Honestly, unless there's something on it you want specifically, most people in your situation just let it sit. She finally looked up. What exactly are you hoping to do with it? Marlene considered the question. I'm going to go look at it first, she said. The woman returned to her screen. That's a start, she said, in a tone that suggested she did not expect it to lead anywhere interesting. There were mornings in Marlene's life when the light came through the kitchen window at an angle that made even the worn countertop look like something worth looking at, and she thought about the idea that attention changed things. Not that it created value from nothing. She was too practical for that kind of thinking, but that looking closely at something was not the same as looking past it. She had seen this with Cass, how a child who was struggling in school needed not more instruction, but more looking at, more genuine examination of where the confusion lived and what shape it took. She had seen it with the furnace, how simply listening to it carefully for a week had told her which fitting was failing before it failed completely, saving her a repair bill she could not have managed. Looking was not passive. It was a form of work. She drove down to Meacham County on a Saturday in late March, leaving before Cass woke up and stopping once for gas and coffee on a highway that ran through the kind of country that was neither beautiful nor ugly, but simply vast, the fields still brown from winter, the sky pressing low and white. She had printed directions from the lawyer's office and confirmed the property line coordinates from the assessor's map, which she had requested by mail and received folded in an envelope so thin it looked embarrassed about its contents. The Voss property sat off a county road that had been paved sometime in the late 1970s and not substantially attended since. The farmhouse where Harlan had lived was visible from the road, a white two-story structure that sat with the settled confidence of a building that had been there long enough to have stopped worrying about it. The main acreage stretched away from it to the north and west. Cecil Gratch, she understood, now owned all of that. The eastern boundary ran the other direction, toward the sunrise, bordered on its far side by a neighboring parcel that had been fallow for years. She parked the car on the gravel shoulder and got out into a morning that was cold but windless, the sky overhead the color of old pewter. She pulled her coat tighter and stood at the edge of the county road, looking at what she owned. The Fencerow was not impressive. She had not expected it to be. It was a strip of land perhaps 15 feet wide running along the eastern edge of what had been the Voss acreage, bounded on one side by a rusted wire fence attached to weathered wooden posts, some straight and some leaning into the years with varying degrees of resignation. On the other side, the line was less defined, trailing into tall grass and the occasional young tree that had volunteered itself over the decades. The width varied, wider in places where the old fence had shifted, narrower where trees had grown close and the boundary had compressed between them. She began to walk. The ground underfoot was soft from recent rain, the kind of soft that grabbed at your boots with each step, not aggressively, but persistently. The grass was the matted pale gold of old growth that had not been cut or grazed in years, and it lay flat in places where rain and frost had pressed it down. She moved slowly, looking at everything without expectation. Old fence posts came in and out of view as the line curved gently with the land's contour. She counted them without meaning to, the way the mind latched onto pattern when given enough quiet to hear itself. Some of the posts were original. She could tell by the wood, which had gone the deep weathered gray of something that had given up its surface color entirely and settled into pure structure. They were cedar, she thought, which explained their survival. Cedar fence posts lasted longer than almost anything else driven into the ground, the wood dense and resistant to rot in ways that other species were not. Her grandfather had told her that once, standing in a field not so different from this one, his hand on a post that had been there since before either of them was born. At about the halfway point, she stopped. There was a section of the fence row where the ground dropped slightly, not dramatically, maybe 8 or 10 inches over the course of a few yards before rising again. The depression was subtle enough that you would not notice it from the road. But walking it, she felt the shift beneath her feet, the way the ground softened differently in the low spot, the way the grass grew thicker and darker there even in March. She crouched down and pressed her hand into the soil. It was wet in a different way than the surrounding ground, not just from rain, but from something underneath, some subsurface movement of water following a path she could not see. She stood and looked at the fence posts closest to the depression. 2 of them were newer than the others. Not new exactly, but decades newer, replaced at some point while the rest of the line aged around them. The wire strung between them was a different gauge, heavier, with a galvanization that hadn't oxidized in the same way as the older sections. Someone had repaired this section deliberately, and not recently, but at a time when the surrounding fence was already old. They had not replaced the whole fence, only this part. She looked at the ground again, the depression, the wet soil, the replaced posts. She walked on, slowly, looking at everything. Toward the far end of the fence row, where it met the wood line at the back of the property. The trees closed in and the light changed. Hardwoods mostly, oak and hickory, their trunks thick and their roots visible in places where erosion had pulled the soil away from them over decades. The fence ended just before the trees began, the last post buried to a different depth than the others, as if it had been set in a hurry or by someone with less experience. Beyond it, the woodline was dense and dark, even in March with the leaves off, the kind of darkness that was about structure rather than shadow. There was a stone at the base of the last post. It was not a remarkable stone. It was a field stone of the kind found throughout the county, pale gray, roughly the size of a shoebox, irregular on its edges but flat on its top surface. It could have been placed there accidentally, carried there by water, or dropped there by a person with no particular intention. But it was too well positioned for accident. It sat directly against the post base, fitted into the angle between the post and the ground, as if someone had placed it there with care. There were faint marks on its flat upper surface. She crouched and brushed away a layer of dead grass and lichen. They were not letters. They were lines, cut with something sharp into the stone surface. Two parallel lines crossed by a third at an angle, and beneath them, a symbol she did not immediately recognize. A shape like a compass rose with one arm longer than the others. The cutting was old. Lichen had grown into the grooves, softening their edges, which meant they had been there long enough for biological growth to establish itself in stone. Years, possibly many years. She sat back on her heels in the wet grass and looked at the stone for a long time. When she drove home that afternoon, she did not tell anyone what she had seen. She was not certain she understood it well enough to describe it. What she had was a collection of details: a subsurface water source, replaced fence posts in a specific location, a marked stone at the fence row's end. Each of these things, taken alone, meant nothing in particular. Together, they formed a question she did not yet have a language for. But she had learned, over the course of 43 years, that questions were not problems. Questions were the first evidence that something was worth understanding. She thought about Harlan Voss on the drive home, the tall, quiet man with the stillness around him, the man who had lived on that land for 60 years without much company or much explanation, the man who had, in the distribution of everything he owned, given away a functional farm and kept back only the Fencerow to leave to her. Not to anyone else, to her specifically, to Marlene, whom he had met twice and who had no special claim to his attention. He had written a whole separate paragraph about it, already the lawyer had said. She pressed her foot against the gas pedal and watched the road unspool ahead of her in the fading afternoon light. Whatever Harlan had known about that Fencerow, he had not told anyone else. He had waited, instead, for the kind of person who would walk its full length before making up her mind. She returned the following weekend with Cass, who had been told only that they were going to look at the land they had inherited and that she should wear boots she did not mind getting dirty. Cass had pulled on her old rubber-soled barn boots without complaint, which was itself a signal that the girl's instincts about things worth paying attention to were developing well. She did not ask many questions on the drive down. She watched the landscape change as the county gave way to the next and the next after that. Her elbow on the window ledge, her expression the particular combination of alert and private that Marlene had learned to read as concentrated thought. They parked where Marlene had parked before, on the gravel shoulder of the county road, and walked the Fencerow together from its beginning. Marlene did not narrate the walk. She let Cass see it without commentary, which she felt was the fairest introduction to a thing still in the process of being understood. Cass walked carefully, watching the ground, occasionally crouching to look at something more closely in the way that teenagers who are not yet self-conscious about curiosity still did naturally. At the depression in the land's middle section, Cass stopped. "The ground is different here," she said. Marlene stopped beside her. "How do you mean?" Cass pressed her boot heel into the soil and watched the impression fill slowly with water. "Wetter. And the grass is different too." She pointed to the darker, thicker growth that occupied the lower area. "That's not the same kind of grass as the rest of it." Marlene nodded. "It's fed by something underground," she said. "Water moving through the subsurface." Cass stood and looked at the two newer fence posts, then at the older ones on either side of them. "Someone fixed this section," she said, "but not the rest of it." Marlene said nothing, just watched. "Why would you fix part of something and not all of it?" Cass asked. "If the whole fence is old, why just these 2 posts?" "That is the question," Marlene said. They walked onto the wood line. When Cass found the stone at the base of the last post, she went quiet in the way that meant she was working something out rather than simply observing. She brushed the lichen and grass away more carefully than Marlene had, using a stick she had picked up along the way, clearing the grooves with patient strokes. "Someone cut this on purpose," Cass said. "Yes," Marlene agreed. "It's old." "Yes." Cass looked up. "Were those symbols?" "I don't know yet." Cass studied them another moment. The long-armed compass shape, the parallel lines with a crossing angle. Then she looked at the post above the stone, at the fence line stretching back along the fence-row toward the road, and back down at the stone. "It's pointing at something," she said. "That long arm. It's pointing in a direction." Marlene looked again. The longer arm of the compass row's shape was angled distinctly, not pointing toward the road or toward the neighboring parcel, but at an angle that, if extended, would pass through the middle section of the fence row, through the depression, through the wet ground and the replaced fence posts and the subsurface water. They stood there for a moment in the quiet of the wood line, the bare trees around them holding their silence with the patience of things that had been waiting a long time. Then Cass said, quietly, the way she said things that mattered, "What did he want you to find?" Marlene did not answer immediately. She looked at the stone and the fence and the strip of land stretching away from them toward the road, all 214 yards of it, and she thought about Harlan Voss, who had been a quiet man, who had kept his own counsel for 60 years, who had left a whole paragraph in his will for a piece of land that everyone else dismissed as worthless. She thought about what it meant to know something for a long time without telling anyone, to carry a piece of knowledge through decades of ordinary days, through seasons and years, and the ordinary accumulation of life, holding it without speaking it because the right person had not yet arrived to receive it. "I think we're meant to look," she said. The first person she called was not a geologist or a lawyer or any kind of official. She called a woman named Ruth Baxter, who had been her mother's friend and who had spent 30 years working the county assessor's office before retiring to a small house with a large vegetable garden and an even larger collection of local history records she had accumulated over the decades, partly out of professional habit and partly out of what she described as constitutional nosiness, which she had never once apologized for. Ruth was 71 and answered her phone on the first ring, which was itself a form of personality. Marlene told her about the Fencerow in measured detail, starting with the call from Aldready and ending with the stone at the wood line. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was unusual enough that Marlene noticed it. "Harlan Voss," Ruth said when Marlene finished. "You knew him?" "I knew of him. Different thing. He came into the assessor's office twice in 40 years, which is remarkably low for a working landowner. Once to contest a drainage easement interpretation, and once to request historical plat maps of his parcel going back to original survey." "When did he request the plat maps?" Ruth was quiet for a moment, the sound of memory being searched. 1987, I think. Maybe 88. I wasn't the one who helped him, but I remember because it was an unusual request. Most people wanted current maps. He wanted original survey documents. Some of them dated back to the 1880s. Why? That's what we wondered too. But he took the copies and left, and nobody followed up. He was not the kind of man you followed up with. You understood when you met him that his business was his business. Marlene sat with that for a moment. "Ruth," she said, "what would someone be looking for in original survey documents?" Ruth exhaled slowly, a sound that contained a certain amount of controlled excitement. "Boundary discrepancies," she said. "Easement origins. What was recorded versus what was actually on the ground. Original plat surveys sometimes documented things that later maps didn't. Water sources, mineral deposits, things that got left out of later versions either by accident or on purpose." "On purpose," Marlene repeated. "It happened," Ruth said, "particularly in the early 20th century when land values were being reassessed and taxation structures were changing. If you knew a piece of land had something on it worth having, and you didn't want to share that information with the county, there were ways to manage what appeared in the record and what didn't. It required access. It required someone in a position of influence. But it happened. The line was quiet for a moment. "I want to see those original surveys," Ruth said. "If Harlan was interested in them, I want to know what he found. Can you get them?" Ruth made a small sound. "Marlene," she said, "I spent 30 years in that office. I know where everything is, including the things that aren't supposed to be easy to find. Give me a few days." Marlene thanked her and set the phone down and looked out the kitchen window at the street, where a neighbor's dog was investigating something under a parked car with the focused attention of a professional. She thought about Harlan requesting plat maps in 1987. She thought about him choosing, in his will, to leave the Fencerow to her specifically, not to a historical society, not to the county, not to a university or any institution equipped to investigate and document. To her, a woman with no academic credentials, no land management experience, no resources beyond what she could stretch from one month to the next. Why her? She had no answer, but the question did not leave her. Ruth called back 3 days later, on a Wednesday evening when Marlene was folding laundry on the kitchen table and Cass was doing homework with her headphones in. The sound in Ruth's voice was different from the first call, a particular quality of restrained urgency that Marlene associated with people who had found something they had not expected. "I have the original survey documents," Ruth said, "from the 1883 plat of the Voss parcel. Marlene, there's something in it that doesn't appear in any subsequent record I can find." Marlene set down the shirt in her hands. "What is it?" "The original survey notated the eastern boundary," Ruth said, "your Fencerow," with a secondary annotation. "It's faint, written in a different hand than the primary survey, which suggests it was added later. But it's on the original document. It reads, subterranean spring, confirmed viable, depth estimated 12 feet, alkaline composition, yield measured at approximately 40 gallons per hour continuous flow." Marlene stood very still. "A spring," she said. "A spring," Ruth confirmed. "A reliable subsurface spring with a documented yield on land that has had no recorded water. Rights attached to it in any survey conducted after 1883. Marlene, water rights in this county sell for anywhere between $50,000 and several $100,000, depending on yield and location. A confirmed 40-gallon per hour continuous flow spring in this part of the state, given current agricultural demand and the drought conditions of the last 15 years, would be worth considerably more." Marlene sat down. "Nobody knew about this," she said. "It's not in any later document I can find," Ruth said. "And water rights in this county were formally registered starting in 1921. If this wasn't registered then, it either got missed or someone made sure it didn't appear. Given that the annotation is in a different hand, my guess is that someone added it to the original survey after the fact, which would be an unusual and deliberate act, and then made sure it wasn't carried into the later registration records." "Harlan knew," Marlene said. "He had to. He requested the original surveys," Ruth said. "He would have seen it. He sat on this for decades." "Why?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. "You'd have to understand what that generation knew about what happens when poor landowners suddenly have something valuable," she said. "Sometimes the knowing of it protected you better than the claiming of it. If he claimed the water rights, he'd have had to register them, defend them, attract attention from people with more resources and legal firepower than he had. As long as the spring existed quietly on paper, no one was reading, it stayed his in the way that mattered to him. He could drink from it. He could use it for himself. He just couldn't sell it or formalize it without opening a door he wasn't sure he wanted to open. But he wanted someone to open it," Marlene said. Ruth's voice was careful. "He wanted the right person to open it," she said, with their eyes open and their expectations calibrated. "Someone who would look at a Fencerow and see more than a strip of weeds." Marlene looked to the kitchen wall. Beyond it, she could hear the muffled bass of whatever Cass was listening to in her headphones, steady and distant, the ordinary sound of a life that didn't know yet that it might be about to change. The thing about decisions made in quiet was that they felt less like decisions and more like clarity arriving from a direction you hadn't been watching. Marlene did not announce to anyone that she intended to pursue the spring. She did not tell Doris at the laundry or Prentice on the porch or anyone at the county extension office who had implied with professional efficiency that she had nothing worth pursuing. She told Cass, who listened with her homework still open in front of her, and then closed it and looked at her mother with the steadiness of someone who had learned to wait for the full explanation before responding. "So there's water," Cass said when Marlene finished. "There may be," Marlene said carefully. "Ruth believes the original survey document is accurate, but we need to confirm it's still there and still viable. Springs could dry up. Subsurface water moves. How do we confirm it?" Marlene had thought about this. "We need someone to look at it properly. Not officially. Not yet, because official attention brings other people's interests into it before we understand what we're dealing with. Someone who knows about groundwater. Someone we can trust to be quiet about it." Cass thought for a moment. "Mrs. Oudkirk's son," she said. "He does environmental consulting. She mentioned him to me when we were talking about the water quality project in my science class. He came to speak to us last fall." Marlene looked at her daughter. "I forgot about that. He was interesting," Cass said, which from Cass was a substantive endorsement. His name was Paul Oudkirk, and he was 38 years old and had the kind of careful precision in his speech that came either from good training or from many experiences of being quoted inaccurately. He met Marlene at the Fencerow on a Thursday afternoon in early April when the sky had finally begun to mean warmth again instead of just light. He brought a ground probe, a basic soil analysis kit, and a notebook. He did not bring anyone else. He walked the depression in the land's middle section with a deliberateness she respected, pressing the probe into the soil at intervals, reading the resistance, noting the moisture content at different depths. He did not speak much while he worked. When he crouched at the section with the replaced fence posts and spent several minutes examining the spacing, she understood that he was looking at the same thing she had looked at. "Whoever fixed these posts knew where the spring was," he said finally. "They position the new posts so they won't interfere with vertical access to the subsurface. You can dig here without disturbing them?" "Yes." Whoever did this knew that. He walked to where the depression was most pronounced and used the probe again, going deeper this time, reading something from the resistance that Marlene could not see but could hear in the quality of his silence. Then he looked up. "There's water moving," he said. 15, maybe 18 feet down. Consistent flow pressure based on what I'm reading." He paused. "This isn't a coincidence of location. Someone knew this was here." The annotation said 12 feet, Marlene said. "From an 1883 survey." Paul Oudkirk sat back on his heels and looked at the ground and then at her. "Subsurface springs deepen slightly over long periods due to surface loading and geological compression," he said. 12 feet in 1883 becoming 15 to 18 now is consistent. He stood. "Do you want me to give you an honest assessment?" "Please," she said. "This is viable," he said. "Flow rate. I'd need actual extraction data to confirm, but based on the pressure readings and the depression topography, the original 40-gallon estimate isn't unreasonable. Could be higher. Drought years compact the surrounding geology in ways that sometimes concentrate flow rather than diminish it." He looked at the fence row, at the line of old fence posts and the two new ones, at the pale gold grass and the distant wood line. "Water rights for a confirmed continuous flow spring of this yield in this county, in the current market," he said, and then stopped and looked at her with the expression of someone making sure the other person is prepared for what they are about to hear. Marlene held his gaze. "Go ahead," she said. He named a number. She stood in the April morning on the land she had inherited and looked at the thin strip of ground running between the fence and the neighbor's fallow field, 214 yards of what everyone had told her was worthless, and she thought about Harlan Voss, 91 years old, keeping his quiet knowledge through 6 decades of ordinary days. She thought about the stone at the wood line with its carved symbols. The long arm of the compass rose pointing back along the fence row toward this exact location. She thought about what it meant to walk the full length of something before deciding what it was worth. She did not cry. She was not the kind of person who cried at the announcement of possibility, having learned long ago that possibility required more than feeling before it became real. But something shifted in her chest, a loosening of something that had been held tight for a very long time, like a knot releasing not all at once, but in stages, the first stage being the simple recognition that the knot existed and that it had been there so long she had forgotten to count it as a burden. She looked at Paul Oudkirk. "What do I need to do," she said, "to make this official?" He nodded, as if he had expected the question and had been preparing the answer on the walk back from the woodline. "We start with a formal hydrological survey," he said. "Independent verification of flow rate and composition. That gives you documentation that can't be challenged. Then you file for water rights registration, which will require a title search on the original boundary designation." He paused. "That's where it gets complicated." "How complicated?" He looked at the Fencerow, at the land that ran alongside it, at the distant farmhouse that now belonged to Cecil Gratch. If the spring was omitted from the water rights registry in 1921, there may be people who benefit from that omission continuing, he said. "When you file, they'll find out, and they may not be pleased." Marlene looked at the strip of land that was hers, the old posts leaning into their years. The two new ones, placed with care around a secret someone had known for a very long time. "I've been not pleased," she said, "for quite a while. I think I can manage the company." Paul Oudkirk looked at her, and then, for the first time since they had begun walking, he allowed something that was almost a smile. He capped his probe and put it back in his kit and looked out over the Fencerow one more time. "The survey can be done by next week," he said, "if you want to move quickly." She looked at the land. She thought about Doris at the laundry calling it a strip of weeds. She thought about Prentice saying nothing down there was worth a plug nickel. She thought about the woman at the extension office who had not looked up from her computer. Then she thought about Harlan Voss walking this same ground in his own way, decade after decade, keeping the secret of it, tending the fence, replacing two posts with the precision of someone, making sure the access point stayed clear and usable for the person who would eventually come and need it. She had walked the full length of the Fencerow. She had not turned back. She had seen the depression and the posts and the stone. She had crouched in the wet grass and brushed lichen from the marked surface and asked what it meant. She had done what Harlan had known she would do, because he had left her the Fencerow, specifically written a whole paragraph about it in his will, and known, somehow, that she was the kind of person who looked at something before deciding it had nothing to offer. "Next week," she said. The morning light moved across the Fencerow, catching the dew on the old grass, turning it briefly into something that glittered. She walked back to her car and drove home through the changing country, and she did not tell anyone what she had found. Not yet. There was more to learn and more to do, and the habit of patience that had carried her this far was not going to abandon her now. But something had changed. The quality of the silence around her future was different. It was no longer the silence of absence. It was the silence of something waiting to be opened, like a sealed document held a long time in careful hands, ready now for the right moment, which had arrived. The week that followed was the strangest of her life, not because of what happened in it, but because of what did not. Nothing changed on the surface. She went to work at the laundry facility on Monday and Tuesday, standing at the folding table in the warm, humid air with Doris on one side of her and the sound of the industrial machines filling the room with their steady percussion. She collected Cass from school on Wednesday and listened to a detailed account of a conflict between two of Cass's classmates that had apparently been building since autumn and reached its conclusion in the school cafeteria over a misunderstanding about a borrowed jacket. She paid the electric bill on Thursday, transferred money between accounts with the practiced care of someone managing margins that did not forgive error, and made a grocery list on Friday evening with the same pencil she had been using for 3 months, its eraser worn to nothing. Ordinary life, the same life she had been living. And yet beneath all of it ran something new, a current she could feel when she was quiet enough to notice it, a sense of altered orientation, like a compass needle settling onto a new bearing after years of pointing at something uncertain. She had not told Doris. She had not told Prentice. She had not, crucially, told anyone who might carry the information somewhere she could not control it. This was instinct more than strategy, though the two were sometimes difficult to separate. She had learned from watching other people's difficulties that the moment you named a thing publicly, other people began to develop opinions about it, and opinions, once formed, had a way of reshaping the thing they were supposedly only describing. She told Ruth Baxter, because Ruth already knew and Ruth was constitutionally incapable of loose talk, having spent 30 years handling information that other people would have paid to access. Ruth received the news of the confirmed subsurface water movement with the measured satisfaction of someone who had expected it, but appreciated the confirmation. Paul Oudkirk was good, Ruth said, when Marlene told her what he had found. He was thorough, Marlene agreed. Thoroughness in the right person at the right time is everything, Ruth said. Has he agreed to do the formal survey? He sent the paperwork over on Friday. I signed it Saturday morning. There was a pause on Ruth's end. There was always a pause with Ruth when she was deciding how much to say. Marlene had come to recognize it as the sound of someone choosing between the efficient and the complete. There's something else you should know, Ruth said. Marlene waited. I did some additional research into the 1921 water rights registration process for that parcel and the adjoining ones. The land that is now registered to the Gratch family, the parcel that borders your Fencerow on the west, was filed under an original registration that referenced a boundary survey from 1919. Ruth paused. That 1919 survey does not match the 1883 plat in several details. The eastern boundary on the 1919 document is drawn differently, a fraction of a degree off from the original, which in practical terms meant that the area, including the subsurface spring annotation, fell outside the registered Gratch boundary by approximately 12 feet. Marlene went very still at the kitchen table. 12 feet, approximately, which is more or less the width of your Fencerow in that section. Someone redrew the boundary, Marlene said. Someone filed a survey that differed from the original, Ruth said carefully. Whether that was error or intention is not for me to determine. But the result was that the spring annotation, which appeared in the original 1883 plat within the Voss eastern boundary, fell into a zone that the 1919 survey placed in an unclear position between the two properties. And when the water rights were registered in 1921, the annotation was not carried forward into either parcel's documentation. So the spring disappeared from the record, Marlene said. From the official record, yes. But Harlan knew it was there. He had the original surveys. Ruth's voice was careful and precise. Harlan Voss was a quiet man who understood, I suspect, that having a piece of paper and being able to act on what the paper said were two very different problems, depending on who else had an interest in the outcome. Marlene thought about this. The Gratch family, she said. How long have they owned that parcel? Cecil Gratch's grandfather filed the original registration in 1921, Ruth said. 3 generations. And now Cecil Gratch inherited the main Voss farmhouse and land. Ruth said nothing for a moment. Yes, she said. He did. Marlene set her hand flat on the kitchen table, the smooth worn wood of it, the table she had bought secondhand 8 years ago and repainted twice, and which had seated every important conversation she'd had in this house since then. She thought about the 2 newer fence posts placed precisely around the access point to the spring. She thought about Harlan, 91 years old, keeping the original survey documents that documented a boundary that contradicted the one used for registration. She thought about the particular kind of patience it took to tend a secret through 60 years of ordinary days, to maintain a fence line precisely, to carve symbols into a stone at the end of a fence row, to write a paragraph in a will leaving that fence row to the one person he had reason to believe would actually walk it. He knew, Marlene said. He knew the whole time that the spring was there and that the registration didn't reflect it. Yes, Ruth said. And he kept the original surveys, so there would be documentation if anyone ever needed to establish what the 1883 boundary actually said. Ruth was quiet for just a moment. That would be a reasonable interpretation, she said. Marlene looked out the kitchen window. The street was still in the late evening light, the long shadows of late April reaching across the pavement. A neighbor's cat moved along the opposite curb with the self-contained purpose of cats everywhere, indifferent to everything that was not immediately relevant to its interests. Ruth, she said, when Paul Oudkirk files the formal hydrological survey, and when I file for water rights registration, is there a mechanism for challenging a historical boundary discrepancy? Ruth's pause this time was longer. It existed, she said, but it required a clear documentary record showing the discrepancy and its effect on the rights in question. She paused again, which is exactly what the 1883 original plat provides, if the annotation in it is legible and attributable. Is it legible? I've had it digitally enhanced, Ruth said. It's legible. Marlene breathed slowly. She thought about the number Paul Oudkirk had named standing at the edge of the Fencerow in the April morning light. She thought about the rental house on Cartwright Lane and the furnace that lost its conviction every January and the rent that went up every 18 months and the grocery lists written with a pencil worn down to nothing. She thought about Cass, 15 years old and watchful, doing homework with her headphones in, asking the right questions at the right moments because she had grown up in a household where paying attention was both necessary and honored. Whatever Harlan had intended when he left her the Fencerow, he had not left her a windfall. He had left her a starting point. He had left her the documentation, the access, the knowledge preserved in the form of an old survey and a marked stone, and trusted her to understand what to do with it. That trust, she felt, was not a small thing. It was the opposite of small. It was the most serious thing anyone had done for her in years. I'm going to need a lawyer, she said. Not Aldretti. Someone who handles property disputes. Ruth made a sound that combined satisfaction and efficiency in equal measure. I have a name, she said. She handles land rights cases. She's good, and she doesn't take on things she doesn't believe in. She will want to see the original documents before she commits to anything. Can you send them to her? I already asked her if she'd be willing to look, Ruth said. She said she would. Marlene laughed, a short surprise sound. Ruth, you were going to need her eventually, Ruth said, without apology. I was just making sure she was available when you did. After the call, Marlene sat for a long time without moving. The house settled around her in the way old houses did in the evening. Small sounds of contraction and ease, the building adjusting itself to the cooling air outside. Through the thin wall, she could hear the low sound of Cass's music from her room, the bass line of something she did not recognize, steady as a heartbeat. She thought about what it meant to inherit something. Not money or land in the simple sense, not objects or accounts, but knowledge. The kind of inheritance that looked like nothing until you understood what you were looking at. Harlan had not left her wealth. He had left her the tools to find what he had spent 60 years protecting. And in doing so, he had trusted her with something more valuable than a bank transfer or a deed to a productive field. He had trusted her with the responsibility of understanding it. She did not feel certain. She felt, instead, the particular clarity of someone who has walked to the edge of a thing she cannot yet see the bottom of and look down not with fear, but with the steady recognition that the looking was necessary, that turning back was not the same as being safe, and that the only real question was whether she was willing to take what she had been given and carry it where it needed to go. She was. She got up from the kitchen table, rinsed her coffee cup, and knocked on Cass's door. Come in, Cass said, pulling one headphone from her ear. Marlene stood in the doorway. There are some things I want to tell you, she said, about what's happening. You should know all of it. Cass set her homework aside and sat up straight, giving Marlene her full attention the way she did when she understood that what was coming was not routine. Marlene sat on the edge of the bed and told her everything. The spring, the original survey, the boundary discrepancy, the registration in 1921 that had erased the annotation, Ruth and Paul Oudkirk, and the lawyer whose name she did not yet have memorized. The number Paul had named in the April morning light beside the Fencerow. Cass listened without interrupting. When Marlene finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the wall above her desk, thinking in the way she did when something required the full use of what she had. So the Fencerow was never just a Fencerow, Cass said. Not to Harlan, Marlene said. He was protecting it, Cass said. All that time. He knew what was there, and he kept it quiet, and he kept the fence maintained so the access point would be there when someone needed it. Yes, and he left it to you because he thought you'd walk it, Cass said. Because you're the kind of person who walks the whole thing before deciding it's nothing. Marlene looked at her daughter, at the dark eyes and the careful mind and the 15 years of paying attention that had made her into someone worth leaving things to in their own right. That's what I think, Marlene said. Cass looked down at her homework, then back at her mother. What happens if the boundary challenge doesn't work? Then we have a Fencerow with a spring on it and water rights that belong to us on whatever basis the original 1883 document can establish, Marlene said. That's still worth something. And if it does work, then it's worth something else, Marlene said. Cass nodded slowly. Are you scared? Marlene considered the question with the honesty it deserved. Yes, she said. Not of the outcome, of the attention. Once this becomes public, it won't be quiet anymore. Cass absorbed this. People are going to say things. People have been saying things my whole life, Marlene said. It hasn't stopped anything yet. Cass smiled, a small private expression that she did not always give easily. Okay, she said. Marlene stood. Get some sleep. She closed the door and stood in the hallway of the rental house on Cartwright Lane, in the narrow space between the bedroom and the kitchen, in the house with the furnace that lost conviction every January, and the walls that the winter found every year, and the landlord who raised the rent on schedule without apology. She stood there and felt, for the first time and longer than she could clearly remember, that the ground beneath her feet was not shifting away from her. It was holding. The formal hydrological survey took 9 days. Paul Oudkirk worked methodically, returning to the Fencerow on 4 separate occasions with different equipment, a bore sampler on the first visit, a pressure monitoring array on the second, a water quality testing kit on the third, and on the fourth, a colleague he introduced only as Rennick, a compact man in his 50s who said very little, but looked at the ground the way some people looked at text they were translating from a difficult language. Rennick had retired from the State Water Resources Board after 23 years, and now consulted independently for parties who needed someone who understood both the hydrology and the institutional architecture around it. Paul had explained this without elaboration, and Marlene had understood that the explanation was itself a form of reassurance. She was present for all 4 visits, watching without inserting herself into the process, bringing coffee in a thermos on the first 2 occasions, and switching to tea on the third when the weather warmed enough that the cold edge of early morning no longer required aggressive countermeasures. Cass came on the 2nd and 4th visits, her presence quiet and observant, taking photographs on her phone with the careful framing of someone who had grown up watching her mother look closely at things before deciding what to do with them. Nobody from the outside world appeared to notice the visits. The Fencerow was far enough from the main road that vehicles pulling onto the gravel shoulder attracted no attention from passing traffic, and the neighboring parcel remained as fallow and empty as it had been for years. Cecil Gratch's farmhouse, visible to the northwest at a distance, showed no signs of unusual activity. Smoke from the chimney in the mornings, a truck in and out on the rhythms of a man managing land in early spring. She watched for signs that he had noticed anything and found none. The full report arrived by email on a Tuesday evening, 14 pages including appendices, written in the methodical language of professional documentation, each claim supported by a reference to specific measurement data. Paul called the same evening, after giving her an hour to read through it, to walk her through the parts he expected would raise questions. The spring is confirmed, he said, without preamble. Flow rate measured at 46 gallons per hour sustained over a 72-hour monitoring period. Composition is alkaline with mineral content consistent with deep limestone aquifer sourcing. Temperature is stable at 52 degrees, which indicates the source is below the frost line and insulated from seasonal fluctuation. 46 gallons, Marlene said. Above the original estimate in the survey annotation, Paul said, which is not surprising. Deep limestone springs often increase yield over time as the channel widens through dissolution. This spring has had 140 years to develop since the original survey. She was quiet for a moment, reading the number in the report again. It did not change. 46 gallons per hour, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, year after year, running through the soil of the Fencerow, while people drove past on the county road and dismissed it as a strip of weeds. What does Rennick say? She asked. Paul paused in a way that meant he was deciding how direct to be. He says it's the cleanest limestone aquifer source he's tested in 15 years of private consulting. He says if the water rights are established and registered, this is not a secondary or supplemental water source. This is a primary agricultural supply for the surrounding region, given current drought projections. He paused again. He also says that the people who benefit most from this not being registered are the people farming the surrounding acreage who have been operating under the assumption that the only water available is from the municipal line, which is expensive, and the shallow well on the Gratch parcel, which Rennick reviewed in public records, and which shows declining yield in each of the last 3 testing cycles. Marlene set the report down on the kitchen table and looked at it. The declining well, she said. The Gratch well has been losing productive capacity for approximately 8 years, Paul said. It's still functional, but the trajectory is clear. Within another 10 years, possibly fewer, it will require either deepening or supplemental sourcing. A limestone aquifer spring 46 gallons per hour continuous flow, 300 yards from the Gratch property line, would resolve that problem entirely, if it were accessible to them, which it has never been registered to be. No, Paul said, it hasn't. The silence on the line held a particular weight. Marlene was not a person who reached for conclusions before she had enough evidence to support them, but the shape of things was becoming clear in the way that shapes clarified when you looked at them from enough angles. The spring had been removed from the record in 1921. The Gratch family had been farming the adjacent land since that year. Harlan Voss had lived alongside that history for 60 years, tending the Fencerow with precision, maintaining the access point, keeping the original surveys in a place he could retrieve them. He had watched and been quiet and done nothing that would alert anyone to what he knew. And then, at the end of his life, he had acted. Not noisily, not confrontationally. He had written a will. Is Rennick willing to serve as an expert witness? She asked. If the registration process becomes contested? He said he would, Paul said. He said, and I'm quoting him directly here because I thought you'd want the exact words. He said that he has been waiting for the right case to establish clear precedent on historically omitted water source registrations, and that this one has better documentation than anything he's seen in his career. Marlene almost smiled. He's been waiting for this too. Some things find the people who are ready for them, Paul said, and she could hear in his voice that he meant it without irony. She thanked him and set the phone down and sat with the report in front of her for a long time. Outside, the street was dark, the April night having settled fully over Cartwright Lane. The furnace was running, its familiar, ticking rhythm a constant in the background of her thoughts. She could hear Cass moving in her room, the small domestic sounds of a teenager preparing for sleep, the creak of the floor, water running briefly in the bathroom, the soft close of a door. She thought about the number, not the dollar figure Paul had named in the field, but the simpler, realer number. 46 gallons per hour. She tried to imagine it, the water moving steadily through dark limestone passages 15 feet underground, cold and clean and continuous, utterly indifferent to the arguments of human beings about who had the right to claim it. It had been there before the fence was built. It had been there when the original survey was conducted in 1883. It had been there when someone redrew the boundary line in 1919. It had been there when Harlan Voss walked the same ground she had walked, crouched in the same wet grass, placed his hand on the same soil, and felt the same difference in its quality. It would be there long after all of them were gone. She picked up her phone and called the lawyer whose name she now knew well, Diana Farrell, who handled land rights cases and who had looked at the documents Ruth had sent, and called Marlene 3 days later with the particular quality of controlled urgency that Marlene had come to recognize in people who had found something worth their full attention. I have the hydrological survey results, Marlene said when Diana answered. How does it look? 46 gallons per hour sustained, she said. Clean limestone aquifer source. Expert witness confirmed and willing. Diana was quiet for exactly 3 seconds, which Marlene had already learned was her version of a long pause. Send me the full report tonight, she said. I want to file the initial registration claim by end of week. Will they push back? Diana's answer was not hesitant. They will push back, she said. The question is not whether, but how, and from which angle. The Gratch family has held that adjacent parcel for 3 generations. When a claim appears that retroactively alters the resource landscape of land they've worked their whole lives, they will engage legal counsel immediately. What matters is that we file first, file clean, and file with documentation that cannot be reasonably contested. The original 1883 survey annotation. Yes, and the 1919 boundary discrepancy documentation that Ruth has assembled, and a hydrological survey, and Rennick's expert assessment. We are not filing a weak claim, hoping for a settlement. We are filing an airtight case, and we are filing it publicly, which means anyone who wants to contest it will have to do so in the open. Marlene absorbed this. There's one more thing, she said. She told Diana about the declining yield on the Gratch well. She told her what Paul had said about the 10-year projection. Diana was quiet for longer this time. That changes the calculus of their response, she said. This isn't just historical. This is about current and future resource access. They have material interest in the outcome that goes beyond pride of ownership. I know. It also means they have known, or should have known, that their water situation was deteriorating and that the nearest viable alternative was 46 gallons per hour of continuous limestone spring flow sitting on a strip of land they may have assumed was either theirs by proximity or too obscure to ever be formally claimed. Marlene thought about the two newer fence posts, the deliberate placement, Harlan maintaining the access point with the precision of someone who intended it to be used. She thought about 60 years of quiet maintenance and one paragraph in a will. Send me everything tonight, Diana said. I'll have the initial filing ready by Thursday. After the call, Marlene did something she had not done since the conversation with Paul in the field. She opened her laptop and searched for the current water rights transaction records in Meacham County and the two surrounding ones. She found the public registry easily enough, a database that was technically available to anyone, but organized in a way that assumed you already knew what you were looking for. She searched by yield category and cross-referenced with recent transactions. The most recent sale of comparable water rights in the region, a limestone spring with a documented yield of 31 gallons per hour attached to a parcel in the adjacent county, had sold 18 months ago for $412,000. 46 gallons per hour was not 31. The market had not gotten less dry in 18 months. She closed the laptop and sat in the quiet. She thought about Doris at the laundry calling it a strip of weeds. She thought about the woman at the extension office typing while she talked. She thought about Prentice on his porch, saying nothing down there was worth a plug nickel. She felt no anger toward any of them. They had not been unkind, exactly. They had simply been unable to see what they had not been looking at. That was a different thing from cruelty. It was the ordinary limitation of people who had learned to assess things by their surface and move on, because moving on was efficient and efficiency was necessary when you had your own pressures to manage. She understood efficiency. She had been practicing it for 20 years. What she had also practiced, without quite naming it, was attention. The particular kind of attention that did not demand an immediate return, but accumulated over time into something useful. The kind that walked a Fencerow to its end before forming an opinion about it. Harlan had seen that in her somehow, across two meetings in childhood, across whatever he had been told or observed or intuited about who she was and how she moved through the world. He had looked at her and known that she would walk the full length before deciding it was nothing. She was trying to honor that. Diana Farrell filed the claim on a Thursday morning, as promised. The filing was precise and complete, citing the original 1883 survey annotation, the documented boundary discrepancy in the 1919 resurvey, the 46-year gap between the omission and the current filing, and the formal hydrological survey results with Rennick's expert assessment appended. It was accompanied by a request for expedited review on the basis of documented historical omission, which, Diana had explained, was a legal mechanism designed for exactly this kind of situation, where administrative error or deliberate manipulation had caused a resource to remain unregistered despite documented existence. The County Water Rights Office acknowledged receipt within 2 hours. By Friday morning, Cecil Gratch knew. Marlene did not know how word traveled that fast. She suspected the county office, where news of unusual filings had a way of moving through unofficial channels before the ink was dry on the formal acknowledgement. She suspected also that a man managing land in that county for his whole life would have cultivated relationships in the relevant offices over decades, the ordinary infrastructure of a landowner who understood that knowing things early mattered. She was at work at the laundry facility when her phone buzzed with a call from a number she did not recognize, a local exchange from the Meacham County area. She stepped away from a folding table and answered it in the break room. The voice on the other end was a man's, older, with the flat, deliberate cadence of someone who had learned to control what his voice expressed in difficult conversations. He said his name was Cecil Gratch. He said he was calling as a courtesy before things got complicated. He said that he had spoken with his attorney and that the filing she had made contained claims that directly affected land he had worked for 30 years and that his family had managed for 3 generations before him. He said he understood that she had recently come into possession of the eastern boundary strip through Harlan's will and that he had no quarrel with that. He said his quarrel was with the interpretation of what the boundary strip contained. She let him finish. Then she said, calmly, that she had engaged legal counsel and that any further discussion should take place through their respective attorneys. He was quiet for a moment. I knew Harlan for 40 years, he said then. He never once mentioned a spring. That may be true, Marlene said. Whatever he thought that strip of land contained, he was a man who held things privately. That doesn't make his private beliefs into legal facts. No, she said. The survey documentation and the hydrological evidence do that. Another pause. I'm asking you, he said, to consider what this looks like. You've been left a Fencerow by a man you barely knew. You're filing claims on resources that have never been registered, never been formally acknowledged, based on a 19th century annotation in a survey document that has not been operative in over 100 years. The annotation was operative in 1883, she said. Whether someone chose to carry it forward in 1921 is a question the documentation addresses. There was a longer silence this time. He was recalibrating. She could hear it. There are costs to this kind of proceeding, he said. Legal costs. Time. Attention from people who have interests in how things are resolved around here. I'm not threatening you. I want to be clear about that. I'm telling you that people who file claims in this county without understanding the full context sometimes find that the context is larger than they expected. Marlene looked at the break room wall, at the laminated safety notice above the door, at the fluorescent light humming in its fixture overhead. She thought about the rental house on Cartwright Lane. She thought about the furnace and the grocery list and the electric bill and the landlord who raised the rent on schedule. She thought about the fact that she had already been living inside a context that was larger than she had been given the resources to address. For 20 years. Mr. Gratch, she said, I appreciate the call. Please have your attorney contact mine. She gave him Diana Farrell's number and ended the call. She stood in the break room for a moment, her hand still around the phone. Her pulse was elevated. She noted that without judgment. It was a reasonable response to the conversation she had just had. A man with 3 generations of land ownership and an attorney and county relationships had told her, in measured and careful language, that she was operating in a context she did not fully understand. What he did not know, what she had not told him, was that she was a woman who had spent 43 years developing a very precise understanding of the consequences of not having resources. She was not unfamiliar with context. She had been living inside the uncomfortable version of it since before he probably thought about it. She went back to the folding table. Doris raised an eyebrow. Everything okay? Fine, Marlene said, and picked up the next item from the pile. Doris watched her for a moment. You look like you just had a conversation that had 2 meanings, she said. Marlene smoothed a crease out of a hospital gown with the flat of her hand. Most conversations do, she said. Doris considered this and then nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to her own work. Diana called that afternoon to tell her that Cecil Gratch's attorney had already contacted her office and requested a preliminary meeting to discuss the filing before the formal review process began. She had agreed to a meeting for the following week. She described the attorney, a man named Burwell who was known in the region for land rights work, as competent and strategic, but not someone who invented arguments. He worked with what he had. What does he have? Marlene asked. Diana's tone was measured. He has 3 generations of good faith land management, a legitimate argument that the annotation in the 1883 survey was never acted upon by anyone for over 100 years, and the suggestion that the 1919 boundary discrepancy was clerical rather than deliberate. He also has the implicit weight of a family that has deep roots in the county and the kind of relationship capital that comes with that. And we have documentary evidence of a resource that was registered in an original survey, omitted from subsequent records, confirmed viable by formal hydrological survey, and currently unregistered due to no fault of the claimant. We also have a clear evidentiary chain showing that the most recent owner of the parcel that includes the spring location was aware of the resource and chose to preserve access to it, in his will specifically. Diana paused. We have a clean case, Marlene. What we don't have is certainty about how long the formal process will take or what pressure will be applied informally in the meantime. What kind of informal pressure? Diana spoke carefully. In counties where land and water have been managed by established families for generations, claims by new or outside parties sometimes encounter friction that doesn't appear in legal filings. Delays in administrative processing. Questions about standing. Third parties who appear with their own interpretations. None of it necessarily improper, but all of it designed to increase the cost in time and resources of pursuing a claim to completion. She was telling her that it would be hard. Not impossible. Hard. Marlene had been managing hard for a long time. It was not the word that frightened her. How confident are you? She asked. 90% that we prevail on the merits, Diana said. The documentation is that clean. What I can't guarantee is the timeline or the emotional cost of getting there. Marlene thought about Paul Oudkirk naming the number in the April morning light. She thought about the spring running 46 gallons per hour through cold limestone passages 15 feet underground, continuous and indifferent and clean. She thought about Harlan Voss, 91 years old, keeping 60 years of patience alive in the form of a paragraph in a will. She thought about what it meant to have been trusted with something. I want to proceed, she said. There was the briefest pause. Diana had been expecting it, Marlene thought. Had perhaps been measuring her from the beginning for exactly this kind of steadiness. Good, Diana said. I'll send you a summary of the meeting agenda for next week. I want you informed at every stage. This is your case. Marlene had never had anyone say that to her about a legal proceeding. She absorbed it carefully. After the call, she sat at the kitchen table until Cass came home from school, and when Cass set her bag down and looked at her mother's face and asked what had happened, Marlene told her all of it. Cecil Gratch's call, Diana's assessment, the 90%, the timeline uncertainty, the informal pressure. Cass sat down across from her at the table. That man called you at work? Yes. Marlene watched her daughter's face move through something. Cass was 15 and had the instincts of someone who had grown up watching her mother navigate pressure with limited resources. She knew what a warning dressed up as courtesy looked like. She had seen the shape of it in smaller forms her whole life. He's scared, Cass said. Marlene looked at her. Why do you say that? Because he called personally, Cass said. If he weren't scared, he would have just had his lawyer send a letter. He called because he wanted to know what kind of person he was dealing with. Marlene sat with this. And what did he find out? Cass folded her hands on the table in a gesture that was entirely her own, no echo of either parent. He found out you were polite, she said, which didn't tell him anything useful. Marlene looked at her daughter and felt something she did not always let herself feel, a clear, uncomplicated pride. Not in herself, in Cass, in the mind that Cass had developed in a household where resources were finite and attention was the currency that compensated. You're right, Marlene said. What happens at the meeting next week? Diana presents the documentation. They present their counterarguments. Everyone measures each other. And then the formal process moves forward, Marlene said. One step at a time. Cass nodded. She looked at the table for a moment, then back up. Mom. Yes. I know it's not settled yet, Cass said. But just so you know, I looked it up after you told me the number. What a spring like that is worth. I looked it up 3 different ways to make sure I was reading it right. Marlene waited. We're going to be okay, Cass said. Not as a wish, but as an assessment. If this works the way Diana thinks it will. We're actually going to be okay. Marlene looked at her daughter in the kitchen of the rental house on Cartwright Lane, with the furnace ticking in the background and the grocery list on the counter and the landlord's last letter still on the stack of papers by the door. She looked at the 15-year-old girl who had grown up watching margins and had learned to read them accurately, and who was now, calmly and without drama, reading this one too. "Yes," Marlene said. "I think we are." The meeting with Cecil Gratch's attorney took place on a Wednesday morning in Diana Farrell's office in the county seat, a second-floor space above a hardware store that had the practical, undecorated quality of a place where serious work happened without attention to impression. Marlene sat beside Diana at a table across from Burwell, a heavy-set man in his 60s who had the smooth, unhurried manner of someone who had spent decades in rooms like this one. Beside him sat a younger attorney she introduced as an associate, who took notes throughout and said nothing. Cecil Gratch was not present. Marlene had expected this and was not surprised. He had sent his representative, which was the correct thing to do and also the thing that established distance. If the meeting went poorly, Gratch had not been there. If it resolved usefully, his attorney had managed it. She understood the geometry. Burwell opened by acknowledging the filing and expressing, in formal terms, his client's concern about claims that reached back over a century into documentation that had not been operative in living memory. He used the phrase operative memory twice, which she noted. He acknowledged that the 1883 survey existed and that it contained the annotation, but argued that the annotation represented an observation rather than a registration, that observations in field surveys did not carry legal weight equivalent to formal water rights filings, and that the omission from subsequent records was most charitably explained by administrative practice of the era rather than by intent. Diana let him finish. Then she presented the documentation in the sequence she had described to Marlene, beginning with the boundary discrepancy between the 1883 and 1919 surveys. She was precise and unembellished in her presentation, which Marlene had come to understand was her particular skill. She did not argue. She placed things in order and let the order speak. When Diana reached the point of the boundary discrepancy, specifically the matter of the spring annotation falling within the original Voss eastern boundary and outside the redrawn 1919 boundary by approximately 12 feet, Burwell's expression changed. It did not change dramatically. It was a slight tightening around the eyes, a fractional shift in the set of his shoulders. A person not watching carefully would not have caught it. Marlene was watching carefully. He knows, she thought. He already knows about the 1919 discrepancy. This is not new information to him, which meant it was not new information to his client, which meant Cecil Gratch had known about the boundary discrepancy for some time. Possibly his father had known. Possibly it had been known for 3 generations, passed down alongside the land itself, a piece of uncomfortable knowledge managed by ensuring that the right people never looked at the right documents in the right order. She sat very still and kept her face neutral and listened to Diana continue. By the time the meeting ended, 90 minutes later, nothing had been resolved and everything had been clarified. Burwell requested additional time to review the hydrological survey documentation and indicated that his client would be providing a formal response within the statutory period. Diana acknowledged the timeline and indicated that the expedited review request would proceed regardless. They shook hands across the table with the professional courtesy of people who understood that the real conversation had not yet begun. In the elevator down to the street, Diana said, quietly, they know about the discrepancy. Yes, Marlene said. That changes what they'll argue. They can't claim clerical error if they've known about it. They'll pivot to adverse possession theory, claiming that the Gratch family's continuous use of the adjacent land constitutes a prescriptive right to the water source. Does that hold? It's a weaker argument than clerical error, Diana said. Adverse possession of a subsurface water source is genuinely difficult to establish when the source was never developed or utilized by the claiming party. They haven't been drawing from the spring. They've been using their well. That matters. They stepped out onto the street. The morning was cool and bright, the kind of spring day that had decided to mean it. Marlene looked at the storefronts along the block, the ordinary infrastructure of a county seat, the insurance office and the pharmacy and the coffee shop with a hand-lettered sign in the window. How long, she asked. Diana looked at her. If they fight it through every available channel, and the process moves at normal administrative pace. She paused. A year, possibly 18 months. Marlene absorbed this. She had 18 months of rent to find, 18 months of groceries and utilities, and the ordinary costs of a life being lived while a process unfolded. She did not have the financial cushion to make that comfortable. Diana was watching her face. "I have a proposal," she said. "I've been thinking about it since the meeting was scheduled." Marlene looked at her. "I want to take this case on contingency. No upfront fees. My compensation comes from the settlement or the registration value when the claim resolves." She spoke clearly, without the hedging of someone offering charity. "This is not generosity. This case will set precedent that matters beyond this specific claim," and Rennick agrees. A clean win on historically omitted water rights with this level of documentation is worth more to both of our practices than a standard fee arrangement. Marlene stood on the sidewalk outside the hardware store in the county seat and looked at Diana Farrell, who had taken on the case because Ruth had sent her the documents and she had read them and called back and said she believed in what was there. She thought about all the people who had told her there was nothing worth believing in. She thought about the spring, 46 gallons per hour, running through limestone in the dark, patient and constant and entirely unconcerned with the arguments of the people above it. "Thank you," she said. Diana nodded once briskly. "Let's go win it." The weeks that followed had a quality of suspension, as if the ordinary rhythm of life had been set slightly out of sync with itself. Marlene went to work and came home and made dinner and helped Cass with an essay about the water cycle that had taken on, in the context of everything happening, an almost comic resonance. She paid the rent and the utilities and bought groceries with the same deliberateness she always had. On the surface, nothing had changed. Underneath, everything had. She noticed it first in small ways. She drove to the laundry facility and did not feel the same dull weight of finality in the routine, the sense that this was simply what her days were and what they would continue to be. Instead, the routine had become something she was moving through rather than being held by. A temporary arrangement. Not permanent. Not the whole story. She noticed it also in how she slept. She had been a light sleeper for years, the kind of sleeping that never quite released its grip on the day's concerns, that surfaced at 2 in the morning with the electric bill, or a noise from the furnace, or a vague, unspecified worry that resisted examination. Now, she slept differently. Not perfectly, not without interruption, but with a different quality to the waking when it came. She woke and thought about the spring instead of the bill, and thinking about the spring was not the same kind of thought. It had direction. It had somewhere to go. The informal pressure Diana had warned her about began in the 3rd week after the filing. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of friction that had no clear origin and no obvious address. A brief item appeared in the local paper, 2 column inches on the back page of the county section, describing a water rights claim that was under review and noting, in the phrasing that local journalism used when it wanted to signal skepticism without stating it, that the claim was based on documentation from the 19th century. The item did not use her name, but it used the location, and in a county where people knew which parcels belonged to whom. That was sufficient. Doris read it at the laundry facility the next day and brought it to Marlene's folding table with the careful approach of someone delivering something that might require delicate handling. "Is this about your Fencerow thing?" she asked. Marlene glanced at the item. "Yes," she said. Doris looked at it again. "The tone of this piece is not particularly supportive of your position." "No," Marlene agreed. "It isn't." Doris set the paper down. She was quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough that Marlene looked up at her. Doris had the expression of someone revising a previous assessment. "The strip of weeds remark," she said. Marlene waited. "I was wrong about that," Doris said. "I didn't know what I was talking about, and I said it like I did, which is a thing I do more than I should." She said it plainly, without excessive performance. "I'm sorry about that." Marlene looked at her. "Thank you," she said. Doris picked up the paper and folded it. "What are they going to try to do?" "Slow it down," Marlene said. "Make it expensive. Make me tired." "Are you going to get tired?" Marlene looked at the pile of folded laundry in front of her, at her own hands working through it with the efficiency of years of practice. "I've been tired," she said. "This is a different kind of tired. This one has somewhere to go. Doris considered this, and then nodded in the way she nodded when she had decided something settled. Good, she said, and went back to her machine. Prentice on the porch said nothing when she walked past him that week. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man recalibrating information he had previously filed under settled, and then looked away at the middle distance, which was his version of acknowledgement. The county extension office sent a letter, formal and unsigned, informing her that the drainage easement on the Fencerow property might be affected by the water rights proceedings and that she should expect to receive additional documentation regarding easement implications from the relevant authority. The letter had the quality of something written by a committee that could not agree on how alarmed to sound. Diana reviewed it and described it as a predictable move to cloud the title question with a secondary administrative process. She sent a response the same day, citing specific statutes on the independence of water rights proceedings from existing easement structures. The response was 3 times the length of the original letter and contained 17 footnoted citations. Marlene read it and thought that Diana Farrell was possibly the most satisfying person she had ever had in her corner. The formal response from Gratch's attorney arrived at the end of the statutory period, as expected, and ran to 41 pages, including exhibits. Diana called Marlene the evening after arrived and summarized it with the efficiency of someone who had read it, understood it, and already begun to work on the counter. They're leading with the adverse possession theory as I expected, Diana said. They have supporting affidavits from 3 people who attest to the Gratch family's continuous and exclusive use of the eastern parcel boundary for over 50 years. They're arguing that even if the spring annotation in the 1883 survey was valid, the Gratch family's presence on the adjacent land constitutes a de facto claim on the associated subsurface resources. Does it? Marlene asked. No, Diana said. For adverse possession of subsurface water to apply, there has to be active use of the resource. The Gratch family has not drawn water from this spring. They have used their well. The spring has been inaccessible because it was on land they did not own and have not entered. The doctrine does not apply to resources you have never actually used, regardless of proximity. What's their second argument? Diana paused. Their second argument is more interesting. They're contesting the reading of the 1883 annotation itself. They have submitted a counter-analysis from a historical document specialist who argues that the annotation in the survey is not in the primary surveyor's hand and may have been added by a third party after the survey was completed, which would make it an unofficial notation rather than a formal survey element. Marlene was quiet for a moment. Is that true? Is it not the primary surveyor's hand? It is in a different hand, Diana said carefully. The original 1883 survey was completed by a man named Aldous Park. The annotation appears to be in a different hand. However, it appears on the original document, which has chain of custody from 1883 to the county archives without break, and it uses the same ink and writing instrument as the survey corrections that are documented as having been made by Park's assistant at the time. Diana paused. Moreover, the fact that it is in a different hand does not mean it is unofficial. Survey annotations were commonly added by assistants, landowners, and county officials at the time. The presence of multiple hands on a survey document is not an indicator of illegitimacy. It is simply an indicator of practice. So their specialist is technically correct, but misleadingly framed. Yes, and Rennick's counter-testimony will address this directly. He has reviewed several hundred historical survey documents from this period and can establish clearly that multi-hand annotations are standard rather than exceptional. Marlene absorbed this. They're going to try to argue that the whole foundation of our claim is based on an unofficial scribble. Yes, and we're going to demonstrate that the scribble is consistent with documented practice, appears on an original document with unbroken chain of custody, and corresponds precisely with confirmed physical evidence in the form of a 46-gallon-per-hour continuous flow spring at exactly the location. And depth specified. The physical evidence cannot be argued away. No, Diana said. It cannot. That's why Paul Oudkirk and Rennick are both essential. The document tells you what should be there. The ground tells you what is there. When they match, the argument about handwriting becomes a distraction. Marlene sat with this. She was learning, through this process, a great deal about the relationship between evidence and argument, about the way that established interests defended themselves not necessarily by disproving the opposing case, but by increasing the friction around it, by multiplying the number of questions that had to be answered, by making the space between the claim and its resolution as long and expensive and exhausting as possible. She was learning this, and she was not breaking under it. She was filing it. Storing in the same place, she stored everything she had learned about managing with limited resources in a world that did not make it easy. In the part of her that did not perform feelings, but simply accumulated the information necessary to keep moving. The formal review hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. Diana described the timeline as reasonable, pushed neither too fast nor too slow, which she attributed partly to the strength of the initial filing and partly to the fact that the expedited review request had been granted, a signal she read as the county office's own assessment that the documentation was substantive enough to warrant priority attention. In those 6 weeks, Marlene did 3 things beyond the ordinary work of her days. She drove to the Fencerow twice more, not to do anything, simply to walk it, to feel the ground under her boots and the weight of the air and the particular quality of the land in May, when the grass had greened up and the depression in the middle section was lush with the moisture from below, and the old fence posts stood against the sky the way they had stood for decades, patient and unimpressed by the arguments being made about them in offices 2 counties away. She walked to the woodline and looked at the stone with its carved symbols and thought about Harlan Voss looking at the same stone on evenings across 60 years, the long arm of the compass pointing back along the Fencerow toward the water beneath. She also called Aldretti, the lawyer who had first told her about the inheritance. She called to ask him directly whether Harlan had ever spoken to him about the Fencerow, whether there was anything in the communications around the will that would indicate Harlan's understanding of what he was leaving her. Aldretti was quiet for a moment on the phone. Mr. Voss was not a communicative client, he said. He came in, told me what he wanted. I drafted it, he reviewed it, and signed it. He did not explain his reasoning, but he was specific about the Fencerow, Marlene said. He wrote a paragraph for it. He did. And when I asked him, as I do with unusual bequests, whether there was anything he wanted noted about the intent, he said only that the person receiving it would know what to do with it. He said that specifically, that I would know what to do with it. He said the person receiving it would know, yes. Marlene stood at the kitchen window, looking at the street. Did he know me? She asked. Did he know anything about me? Another pause. He had a newspaper clipping, Aldretti said. He pulled it out during one of our meetings when we were discussing the bequest. It was from your local paper. A small item about a woman who had repaired a community center furnace herself when the contractor the county hired failed to show up for 3 consecutive appointments. He said it was his great-niece. Marlene closed her eyes for a moment. She had repaired that furnace 4 years ago with a YouTube tutorial and a borrowed set of wrenches and stubbornness. It had taken a weekend. The item in the paper had been 2 sentences. She had not thought about it since. Harlan Voss, 91 years old, in a lawyer's office in another county, had been carrying a newspaper clipping about her furnace repair in his pocket. Thank you, she said to Aldretti, and the words were carrying more weight than he knew. She told Cass that evening. Cass listened and was quiet for a long time, and then said, softly, he was watching out for you, the only way he knew how. Yes, Marlene said, from far away, with what he had. Yes. Cass looked at the table. That's kind of everything, she said. Doing what you can from where you are with what you've got. Marlene looked at her daughter. Yes, she said. That's kind of everything. The third thing she did in those 6 weeks was this. She applied for a small business planning grant from the State Agricultural Development Office. The grant was designed for landowners who were developing new agricultural water infrastructure, and Rennick had mentioned it in passing as something to have in motion for after the hearing, when the registration would need to be converted into a practical development plan. The application required a description of the resource and its intended use, a statement of community impact, and a landowner affidavit. She wrote the affidavit herself, not Diana, not Ruth. She sat at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening when the house was quiet and Cass was asleep and the furnace was ticking, and she wrote 2 paragraphs about a woman who had inherited a strip of land everyone said was worthless, walked it to its end, and found a spring that had been running for 140 years through limestone in the dark, patient as anything she had ever known. She did not know yet whether the hearing would go the way Diana believed it would. She did not know whether the adverse possession argument would find unexpected traction or whether the document specialist's testimony about handwriting would introduce enough uncertainty to delay things further. She did not know whether the informal pressure would find new forms or whether the 18 months Diana had projected would extend further still. What she knew was what she had walked, what she had looked at, what she had not turned away from. The Fencerow was 214 yards long, and she had walked every yard of it. She sealed the grant application and set it with the papers by the door and went to bed. The hearing was 6 weeks away. The spring was running. The hearing was held on a Thursday morning in the county administrative building, a low brick structure on the main road of the county seat that housed the water authority, the land records office, and a small courtroom used for proceedings that were too formal for a conference room and too minor for the circuit court. Marlene arrived 40 minutes early, which was her habit in situations where arriving late would cost her composure. Diana was already there, seated at one of the 2 tables facing the review panel's raised platform, her documents arranged in the precise order she had described to Marlene during their preparation sessions. A yellow legal pad sat open, her handwriting filling half the page in a neat compressed script of someone who thought faster than most people spoke. Marlene sat beside her and looked at the room. It was smaller than she had imagined, which surprised her. The ceiling was low, the windows narrow, the fluorescent lighting doing the same indifferent work it did in every institutional space she had ever sat in. There were 6 chairs for the review panel, 3 of which were already occupied by people reviewing papers without looking up. There was a table for witnesses to one side, a row of public seating along the back wall, and a wooden podium near the door that had the look of something borrowed rather than permanent. Paul Oudkirk was seated in the witness row, his field notebook on his knee, his expression the calm of someone who had prepared for every question that might be asked. Rennick sat beside him, his hands folded, looking at nothing in particular, which she had come to understand was his version of deep concentration. Ruth Baxter was in the public seating, having driven 2 hours without being asked, wearing the expression of someone who had waited a long time to see a particular document receive the recognition it deserved. Cecil Gratch arrived 7 minutes before the scheduled start. He came in quietly, without theater, and took a seat at the opposing table beside Burwell. He was older than she had imagined from the phone call, late 60s, with the weathered look of a man who had spent his working life outdoors and the careful posture of someone who understood that how you held yourself in a room communicated things you might not intend. He did not look at her when he sat down. She looked at him without hostility, simply noting. The 3 remaining panel members arrived together at 2 minutes before the hour and took their seats without ceremony. The chair, a woman named Hollister who had the clipped efficiency of someone who ran proceedings the way experienced pilots ran instruments, opened without preamble. She stated the matter, the date of filing, the parcel identification, the nature of the claim, and the basis for expedited review. She noted the documentary evidence submitted by both parties and the expert witnesses available to testify. She outlined the format. Each party would present their opening position. Witnesses would be examined. Panel members would ask questions, and a determination would be issued within 30 days of the hearing's conclusion, with the possibility of extension if the panel required additional review time. Diana presented first. She was unhurried and sequential, building the case in the order she had described to Marlene over weeks of preparation, beginning with the 1883 survey, moving through the boundary discrepancy, establishing the chain of documentation, and arriving at the hydrological confirmation. She did not speak loudly or quickly. She used the precise, undecorated language of someone who had decided that the facts were persuasive on their own terms, and that ornamentation would only create openings for challenge. When she placed the original 1883 survey document on the panel table, enlarged and annotated with translucent overlays showing the annotation location and the boundary discrepancy, Hollister leaned forward slightly. It was a small movement. Marlene watched it the way she had watched Burwell's expression at the preliminary meeting, reading the involuntary signals that professional composure could not entirely suppress. Hollister was interested. She was genuinely, substantively interested. Burwell presented next. His argument followed the structure Diana had anticipated. Adverse possession theory, supported by the three affidavits. The document specialist's handwriting analysis suggesting unofficial annotation status, and a broader argument about the equitable weight of 3 generations of good faith land management against a claim rooted in documentation that had been functionally dormant for over a century. He was skilled and unhurried, and he made the case as well as it could be made. When he finished, Hollister asked him a direct question. She asked whether the Gratch family had, at any point in the documented history of their ownership, drawn water from the subsurface spring on the adjacent parcel. Burwell said they had not. Hollister made a note. Paul Oudkirk testified for 45 minutes. He walked the panel through the hydrological survey methodology, the monitoring data, the composition analysis, and the yield confirmation with the thoroughness of someone who had anticipated every technical question and prepared a clear answer for each. When one panel member asked about the variance between the 1883 estimated depth of 12 feet and the current confirmed depth of 15 to 18 feet, Paul explained the geological compression process that produced that variance over 140 years with the patient clarity of someone who had spent his career translating technical knowledge for non-specialists without condescension. He was credible in the way that only genuine expertise was credible, not polished or performed, but honest and precise and willing to say when he did not know something, which he did twice, both times specifying what additional testing would be required to answer the question definitively. The panel responded to this with the particular attention that people gave to witnesses who did not overstate their knowledge. Rennick testified for 30 minutes. He addressed the adverse possession question directly, citing 4 precedents from regional courts and 2 from adjacent states in which claims to subsurface water resources had failed on adverse possession grounds when the claiming party could not demonstrate active extraction or utilization of a specific source. He then addressed the handwriting analysis, not by contesting the finding that the annotation was in a different hand, but by placing it within the context of surveying practice in the 1880s, presenting documentation of 12 survey records from the same period in the same county that showed multi-hand annotations as standard practice, 5 of which had been treated as operative by subsequent water rights proceedings without challenge. He was brief. He cited specific precedent and specific parallel documentation. He made no rhetorical appeals. When he finished, one of the panel members who had not yet spoken asked him directly whether in his professional assessment the spring annotation in the 1883 survey was a legitimate survey element or an unofficial addition. Rennick looked at the panel member without hesitation. In my professional assessment, he said, the annotation is consistent in every material respect with legitimate survey documentation of that period. The handwriting distinction is real, but not operationally significant given established practice. The annotation is corroborated by physical evidence that cannot be manufactured or altered retroactively. In 23 years of reviewing historical water resource documentation, I have not seen a more clearly supported omitted registration claim. The room was quiet after that in the way rooms went quiet when something definitive had been said. Burwell made his rebuttal with skill and composure, but Marlene could hear, in the slight adjustment of his register, the sound of an argument that knew its own limits. He pressed the adverse possession theory and the equitable concerns without abandoning them, but the force behind the words had shifted. He was maintaining a position rather than advancing one. The panel asked questions for an hour after the testimonies. Most of the questions went to Diana and to the expert witnesses. Several went to Burwell. One panel member asked Marlene directly whether she had been aware of the spring before walking the property, and she answered honestly and plainly that she had not, that she had been told she had inherited a strip of transitional vegetation with no assessed value, and that she had walked the property herself before forming any opinion about what it contained. The panel member nodded. The hearing concluded just before noon. Hollister thanked both parties, reminded them of the 30-day determination timeline, and closed the session with the efficiency of someone who had other proceedings to manage. In the hallway outside the hearing room, Cecil Gratch stopped beside Marlene for the first time that day. His attorney was several steps ahead, talking quietly on his phone. Gratch looked at Marlene with the expression of a man who had been engaged in a long-standing argument and had arrived, somewhere in the last 3 hours, at the conclusion that the argument was finished. He did not apologize. She did not expect him to. What he said instead was simpler and, in its way, more honest. He said that Harlan had been a good neighbor for 40 years. He said that he had understood, without them ever discussing it directly, that Harlan knew things about the land that he never shared, and that he had always assumed this was simply the way Harlan operated. He said that he had not known about the 1919 survey discrepancy until his attorney found it in the course of preparing the response to her filing. Marlene listened without expression. He said that he did not know whether he believed that. He said it quietly, to himself as much as to her, and she understood that this was a man reckoning with the possibility that a piece of knowledge had been held by the people around him for a long time, and that he had benefited from its suppression without having personally arranged the suppression. That this was not the same as innocence, but was also not the same as guilt, and that the space between them was uncomfortable to inhabit. He looked at her then with the directness of someone deciding to say the true thing. Whatever the panel decides, he said, the water is real. The spring is real. There's going to be a point where practical questions matter more than the legal ones. She looked at him steadily. There always is, she said. He nodded once and walked away down the hallway. Diana appeared at her elbow. What was that? A man thinking out loud, Marlene said. Diana looked after him. That's usually a sign that they're preparing to stop fighting. Marlene thought about it. He didn't know, she said, about the 1919 survey. I think he actually didn't know. Diana was quiet for a moment. That doesn't change the legal facts. No, Marlene said, but it changes the human ones. They walked out into the midday light together, and Marlene blinked against the brightness of it and thought that she had done everything she could do and that the next 30 days were not hers to manage. The case was in other hands now, the hands of the panel and the precedents and the documents, and all she could do was go home and keep living the life she was living and wait for the ground to settle. She drove home through the same country she always drove through, and the fields on either side of the highway were green with the full presence of late May, and the sky was the uncomplicated blue of a morning that had decided to be simple, and she found, somewhere in the 2-hour drive, that the particular pressure behind her sternum that had been constant for 6 weeks had eased slightly, like a window opened in a room that had been closed too long. Not gone. Eased. It was enough. The 30 days were 30 of the longest and most ordinary days she had lived through. She went to work and came home. She paid bills and made grocery lists. She drove Cass to a school event on a Saturday that had nothing to do with Fencerows or springs or water rights, a theater production in which Cass had been helping with the technical crew, and she sat in the auditorium and watched the lights go up and felt the ordinary pleasure of watching her daughter do something competently and without anxiety, and she tried not to think about the determination that was coming and mostly succeeded. Ruth called midway through the 30 days to report that she had run into one of the panel members at the pharmacy. They had not spoken about the hearing. Ruth reported this as information with a particular edge to it. She said that the panel member had looked at her in the way that people looked at you when they knew something you were connected to and found it interesting. She described it as the expression of someone who had read the ending of the book and was being careful not to give it away. Marlene thanked her and did not read too much into it. She had been disappointed by interpreted signals before. She preferred to wait for the actual words. Diana called on day 27 to let her know that the panel had not requested an extension, which she said was meaningful. Extensions were typically requested when the panel was uncertain or when additional research was needed. The absence of an extension request, she said, suggested that the panel had reached a determination and was in the process of formalizing it. 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning when Marlene was at the folding table at the laundry facility and Doris was telling her about a situation involving her sister-in-law and A. Disputed inheritance of a very different and considerably less consequential kind. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She looked at the screen. Diana. She excused herself and stepped into the break room. Diana spoke without preamble, which was how she always delivered significant information, as though pausing before it would only extend the time between the fact and its reception. The panel has issued its determination, she said. Registration claim upheld in full. The 1883 survey annotation is recognized as a legitimate survey element. The boundary discrepancy in the 1919 resurvey is formally noted as an error of record with administrative consequence. The water rights for the subsurface spring on the eastern boundary strip of the Voss parcel are registered in your name effective today. Marlene stood in the break room of the laundry facility and pressed her hand flat against the laminate counter and breathed. The adverse possession claim? Rejected, Diana said. The panel accepted Rennick's testimony on the utilization requirement. They were specific in the determination that proximity without active extraction does not constitute a claim on subsurface water resources. The handwriting argument? Noted and dismissed, Diana said. The panel adopted the language from Rennick's testimony almost verbatim. They referenced his 12 parallel survey examples and concluded that the multi-hand annotation was consistent with documented period practice. Is it over? Marlene asked. Gratch can appeal within 60 days, Diana said. But Marlene. She paused, which was unusual. Burwell called me this morning before the determination was released. Before. He asked whether you would be open to a conversation about a practical arrangement regarding the water resource going forward. That's not the language of someone preparing an appeal. That's the language of someone who has read the determination and is thinking about the next chapter. Marlene was quiet for a moment. What kind of arrangement? We don't know yet. But a continuous flow limestone aquifer spring at 46 gallons per hour, confirmed clean and viable, sits on your land and sits adjacent to a farm with a declining well. There's a practical reality there that exists independently of who was right in the legal proceeding. Gratch knows that. His attorney certainly knows that. She thought about what Cecil Gratch had said in the hallway, that there was going to be a point where practical questions mattered more than legal ones. He'd been preparing for this conversation, she realized. Not the hearing, the one after it. Tell Burwell I'm open to a conversation, she said, through counsel, and that I'll need full documentation of the Gratch well's current yield status before any arrangement is discussed. Diana made a sound that contained satisfaction. That's exactly right, she said. After the call, Marlene stood in the break room for a moment longer than she needed to. The sounds of the facility came through the door, the rhythm of the machines, Doris's voice carrying over them with its characteristic certainty, the ordinary working sounds of a place she had been coming to for years. She thought about the spring, running right now, this minute, 46 gallons per hour through cold limestone passages in the ground of the Fencerow that everyone had told her was a strip of weeds. Running the same way it had been running since before the fence was built, since before the county road was paved, since before the survey was conducted in 1883 by Aldous Park and his assistant with their different handwriting. Patient and constant and entirely indifferent to what the people above it had decided about who it belonged to. It was hers now. Officially, legally, documentably hers. She went back to the folding table. Doris looked at her face and stopped talking about her sister-in-law. She read whatever she saw there with the accuracy of a woman who had worked alongside other people for 30 years and learned to hear what was not being said. Well, she said. We won, Marlene said. Doris stood for a moment. Then she sat down what she was holding and put her arms around Marlene in the direct, uncomplicated way of someone who had revised her assessment of a situation and was acting accordingly. Marlene accepted this briefly and then stepped back because she was not, by nature, a person who prolonged the physical expression of emotion, and Doris knew this and released her without making an issue. I owe you an apology, Doris said. You gave me one already, Marlene said. I'm giving you another one. Doris picked up what she had set down. A strip of weeds. She shook her head at herself. I said that like I knew. You said it like people say things when they don't look closely, Marlene said. It's a very common way to say things. Doris looked at her. "You're not going to let me properly grovel, are you?" "There's work to do," Marlene said, and nodded at the pile. Doris laughed, a genuine sound, and they went back to work. She told Cass that evening. She had thought, during the drive home, about how to frame it, and had decided, as she always decided, that the straightforward telling was the only honest one. She sat across from Cass at the kitchen table and said the determination had come in and they had won, and watched her daughter's face move through something that started as careful and arrived at real. Cass didn't whoop or cry or perform the moment. She sat with it for a few seconds, her hands flat on the table, her eyes steady, absorbing it the way she absorbed significant information, fully and without rush. Then she said, "What happens now?" Marlene had thought about this. "Now we figure out what it's worth and what to do with it," she said. "Diana thinks Gratch will want to discuss a water supply arrangement, which would mean a formal usage agreement and ongoing payment for access to the spring. That's one possibility. There's also the option of developing the resource independently, which is more complicated and more capital-intensive. And there's the grant application, which could provide partial funding for infrastructure if we go that route." Cass was quiet. "Which do you want to do?" "I don't know yet," Marlene said honestly. "I want to know all of the options before I decide." Cass nodded. "That's very you." Marlene looked at her daughter. "Yes," she said. "It is." There was a silence between them that was comfortable, the particular comfort of two people who had been managing difficult things together for a long time and knew the texture of the silence between efforts. "Mom," Cass said. "Yes." "Are we going to leave this house?" Marlene looked around the kitchen. The worn countertop, the furnace ticking in the background, the grocery list on the counter, the landlord's correspondence in the stack by the door. She thought about what it would mean to leave, what it would mean to stay, what the difference felt like from the inside. "Eventually," she said. "Not tonight, not tomorrow, but we're not going to be here forever." Cass looked at the table. "I don't hate this house," she said. "I know," Marlene said. "I just want us to be okay." Marlene reached across the table and put her hand on her daughter's. "We are," she said. "We actually are." The conversation with Gratch's attorney happened 3 weeks after the determination. Burwell presented it as an exploratory discussion and kept to that framing throughout, which Marlene appreciated for its honesty about what it was. Cecil Gratch was present this time, seated beside Burwell with the posture of a man who had decided to be present for his own affairs rather than manage them through intermediaries. He looked at her directly when she came in, which she noted as different from the hearing. The proposal was straightforward in its structure. The Gratch farm was facing a water supply problem that would become critical within the next decade. The spring on the Voss Fencerow was the most viable solution within practical distance. Gratch was proposing a 30-year water supply agreement under which he would pay an annual access fee for the right to draw a specified volume from a spring, with the infrastructure costs shared between both parties, with annual review provisions built in to adjust the fee to market rates, and with a first right of refusal clause if Marlene ever chose to sell the water rights outright. Diana had reviewed the structure before the meeting and described it as a serious and well-constructed offer that reflected accurate understanding of the resource's value. She had also prepared a counter-proposal that addressed 3 specific points she found undervalued in the initial terms. Marlene listened to Burwell present the offer and then listened to Diana present the counter. She watched Cecil Gratch's face through both presentations with the attention she had brought to every part of this process. He did not flinch at the counter. He listened to the 3 modified terms with the expression of a man doing the arithmetic of what he needed against what was being asked of him. The negotiation took 2 hours. It was not contentious. It had the quality of 2 parties who had finished fighting and were now solving a problem, which was a different and considerably more efficient process. The 3 modified terms were discussed individually. One was accepted without change. One was modified to a middle position that both parties acknowledged was fair. One required a technical consultation that was scheduled for the following week. At the end of the 2 hours, the framework of an agreement existed. It was not signed. There were details to finalize and documents to draft. But the shape of it was clear, and the shape was this: A resource that had been hidden for 100 years would now flow, legally and practically, to the people who needed it, with the woman who had found it receiving ongoing compensation that would, over the term of the agreement, amount to something she had never had before. Security. Not extravagant security. Not the security of people who did not have to think about money. The security of someone who had enough of a foundation beneath her that the ground did not shift with every unexpected cost. After the meeting, walking to their cars in the parking lot of Diana's building, Cecil Gratch stopped again beside her. He said, "I looked into the 1919 survey discrepancy." He said it without preamble, without the careful management of the phone call months earlier. I asked people who would know. The discrepancy wasn't clerical. My grandfather knew about the spring. He arranged for the resurvey to be filed with the adjusted boundary. He wanted the spring to fall in the ambiguous zone, so it wouldn't be registered to the Voss parcel while he was establishing his own water rights registration. Marlene looked at him. He didn't take it, Gratch said. He just made sure it wasn't officially there so they couldn't sell it or leverage it at a moment when he might need it in the future. He thought the Voss family would eventually leave or sell, and then the boundary ambiguity would resolve in his favor. He didn't account for Harlan. Nobody accounted for Harlan, Marlene said. Gratch looked at her. No, they didn't. He stood there for a moment. I'm not telling you this because I think it changes anything legally. It doesn't. I'm telling you because I think you should know the full history of what you were given. She thought about Harlan tending the Fencerow for 60 years, maintaining the fence precisely, replacing 2 posts with the care of someone preserving an access point, requesting the original survey documents in 1987, keeping a newspaper clipping about a woman who repaired a furnace because she was the kind of person who figured things out when they needed to be figured out. 60 years of knowing, she said. 60 years of knowing what had been done and keeping it quiet and maintaining the access and waiting. Gratch looked at the ground. That's a long time to carry something. It is, she said. He nodded once and got into his truck and drove away. She stood in the parking lot for a moment. The afternoon was warm, the last heat of a June that had been generous with its light. The building behind her held Diana's office and the hardware store beneath it, and the ordinary commerce of a county seat going about its business. The street beyond the parking lot ran past the insurance office and the pharmacy and the coffee shop with its hand-lettered sign, past the administrative building where the hearing had been held, past all the visible structures of a place where people had been living and working and deciding things for generations. Underneath all of it, in ways that didn't show on any current map, the past continued to move. She thought about the spring, running right now, through its limestone channel, patient and cold and constant. Running through the ground of the Fencerow, she had walked on a gray March morning with boots that got muddy and expectations that asked nothing of the land before looking at it. Running the way it had run when the 1883 survey was conducted and the way it would run long after every argument about it was forgotten. Some things endured by being themselves, by not requiring acknowledgement to continue existing, by simply flowing day after day, year after year, in the dark, until the right person came along and walked the full length of the ground above them and asked what was there. The practical changes in Marlene's life did not arrive all at once. They came the way things came, when they had been earned rather than stumbled into, in stages that built on each other, each one making the next possible. Each one felt more fully because she understood what it had taken to get there. The first stage was the end of the worst kind of uncertainty. Not all uncertainty, not the ordinary uncertainty of a life being lived, but the particular uncertainty of not knowing whether the floor would hold. The water agreement, once finalized and signed, generated an initial payment that she used for 3 specific things she had planned for weeks before the ink was dry. She paid off the last of the debt that had accumulated during a medical situation 3 years earlier, when Cass had needed a procedure that the insurance had partially covered and her savings had not been sufficient to bridge. She made a repair to the rental house furnace that the landlord had been promising for 2 years and declining to schedule, and she opened a savings account with a balance in it that was sufficient to constitute a cushion, the first time in 11 years that she had held money whose purpose was not immediately allocated to a specific obligation. The second stage was the move. Not to a different town, not to a different life, but to a different house in the same town. A house she found on a residential street 2 blocks from where Cass went to school, a house with 3 proper bedrooms and a furnace that had been replaced 4 years ago, and a yard where the previous tenants had planted a vegetable garden that would need to be cleared and replanted in spring. She paid a first and last month's deposit and signed a lease that was slightly more per month than the one on Cartwright Lane, and did the arithmetic with a freedom she had not had before, the arithmetic of someone who had income beyond what each month immediately required. The third stage was quieter and mattered more than either of the practical ones. It was the change in Cass. Not a dramatic change, not a reinvention, but a gradual easing of the vigilance that Cass had carried for as long as Marlene could clearly remember. The watchfulness of a child who had grown up understanding that resources were finite and that unexpected costs had consequences. It did not disappear overnight, but it softened week by week in ways that showed up in small things. Cass began to sleep later on weekends without the quality of guilt that used to attend it, the sense that sleeping late was an indulgence she had not quite earned. She mentioned once a school trip that she wanted to go on, and she mentioned it the way teenagers who were not managing their parents' anxiety mention things, directly and with a mild expectation of yes rather than the careful calculation of what the answer might cost. Marlene said yes immediately, and the look on Cass's face was the look of someone receiving something they had not quite believed was available. "You don't have to look like that," Marlene said. "I know," Cass said. "I'm not going to stop yet, though." Marlene looked at her daughter and felt something she could not name precisely, something that was grief and gratitude together, the recognition of what they had managed through and what it had cost both of them, and the reality that they had managed it and were still here, and that being still here on the other side of something hard was its own form of abundance. Ruth Baxter came to dinner at the new house in August. Bringing a bottle of wine she had been keeping for an occasion she said she had always believed would present itself. She looked around the house with a thorough appreciation of someone who understood what it meant and did not perform a sentiment she did not feel. She sat at the kitchen table that had been moved from Cartwright Lane, the table that had held every important conversation, and she drank her wine and told Marlene that Harlan Voss had been a man of extraordinary patience, and that she thought he had known from very early in the process that the Fencerow would eventually find the right person, and that finding the right person was more than he could do alone, and that leaving something capable of finding its own way to the person who needed it was a form of love that not everyone had the longevity or the foresight to practice. Marlene listened to this and was quiet for a moment. She looked at the kitchen window of the new house, at the evening light coming through it, clean and unhurried. She thought about a man she had met twice in childhood and who had, in the only way available to him, made sure that she would not be without. "I'm going to go back to the Fencerow," she said. "When things settle, I want to walk it again." Ruth raised her glass. "Walk it to the end this time with something different in your chest," she said. "What's that?" Ruth considered. Knowledge of what it was worth the whole time. Marlene raised her own glass. She walked the Fencerow again on a September morning when the air had the first edge of autumn in it and the grass had gone gold the way it always did at this time of year. She parked on a gravel shoulder and walked from the county road end, and the ground was familiar under her boots, the particular unevenness of it, the way the fence posts spaced themselves along the boundary with their patient irregularity. She walked slowly, the way she had walked it the first time, not to arrive anywhere, but to attend to what was there. At the depression in the middle section, she stopped. The 2 newer fence posts stood precisely where Harlan had placed them. The ground between them was soft with the moisture from below, the grass darker and thicker there. She pressed her hand into the soil and felt the difference in it, the deep sustained wetness of ground with a constant source below. 46 gallons per hour. Running right now. She stood there for a long moment with the autumn light on her face and the smell of the turned season in the air, and she thought about all the people who had driven past this strip of land and not stopped, and all the people who had told her it was nothing, and all the things that turned out to be something when you looked at them closely enough and long enough and without deciding in advance what you expected to find. She thought about Harlan, about the 60 years, and the 2 fence posts, and the stone at the wood line, and the newspaper clipping and the paragraph in the will. about the particular faith it took to leave something to someone who did not know they were being trusted with it, about what it meant to be trusted that way and to have been worth the trust. She thought about Cass sleeping late on a Saturday without guilt, about the savings account balance that was still there 3 months later because nothing had come along that required its immediate sacrifice, about the dinner with Ruth and the wine that had been kept for an occasion and the table that held the conversation, the same table that had held all the others, moved to a different room in a different house where the furnace worked and the windows held the winter. She walked onto the woodline. The trees had begun to turn, the first yellowing of the hickory leaves, the oaks still holding green but with the shade of change beginning at their edges. She reached the last fence post and crouched beside the stone. It was the same. The carved symbols, the parallel lines with the crossing angle, the compass rose shape with its longer arm pointing back along the fencerow toward the water. She brushed the lichen from the grooves with the same stick Cass had used in April, clearing them gently, and looked at them. She thought about what it meant to leave a sign like this. Not a legal document, not a financial instrument, not even a letter. A stone, a shape cut into a stone with something sharp, and set at the base of a post at the end of a strip of land that everyone agreed was worthless. A sign that said, "There is something here. Look, come all the way to the end and look." She sat back on her heels in the autumn grass and looked at the symbols for a long time. Then she said quietly, to no one who was present, "Thank you." The trees held their quiet around her. The sky was the deep blue of a September morning that had decided to be exactly what it was. Somewhere below her, through the soil and the rock and the dark passage carved by water over 140 years, the spring ran steady and cold and constant, giving itself without reservation to the ground above it, asking nothing of the arguments and the documents and the determinations and the practical arrangements of the people whose lives it had moved through. It simply ran. She stood and brushed the dirt from her knees and walked back along the fence row to where her car waited on the gravel shoulder, and the 214 yards of ground she walked had the same quality it had had on the first morning, unhurried and patient, revealing itself to whoever was willing to cover it at the pace it deserved. She drove home through the September countryside, through the fields with their late harvest colors and the roads she had driven all her life, and she thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who walked the full length before deciding. It was not a skill. It was not talent. It was a choice made again and again, in small situations and large ones, to cover the ground honestly before forming the conclusion, to resist the efficient shortcut of the first impression, to believe that the end of the line was worth reaching even when everything visible from the beginning said there was nothing there. Harlan Voss had believed that about her. He had kept a newspaper clipping and written a paragraph in a will and trusted her with 60 years of patient knowledge because he had read her correctly from 2 meetings and a story about a furnace. He had known that she was the kind of person who looked before deciding. She intended to spend the rest of her life being worth that assessment. She had not been given a fortune in the traditional sense. She had been given a starting point and trusted to understand what to do with it. She had walked to the end of the fence row. She had looked at what was there. She had not turned away when the ground was hard, or the questions were complex, or the people with more resources told her the context was larger than she understood. She had simply covered the distance that needed to be covered, 1 yard at a time, on boots that got muddy, in a direction that had been pointed out by a man she barely knew who had understood something essential about her from very far away. The road ahead was clear and long and open. She pressed her foot gently on the gas and drove toward it. Paul Oudkirk sent her a message in October, a brief note attached to a copy of a paper Rennick had submitted to a regional hydrology journal documenting the case as an example of historically omitted water resource registration. The paper referred to her only as the claimant, which was fine by her. The spring was referred to throughout by its technical designation, its coordinates and yield data and composition profile, all the measurements and readings that translated the fact of it into the language of professional documentation. She read through the paper twice, not for the technical language, which she understood imperfectly at best, but for the shape of it, the way a thing she had walked and touched and crouched beside in muddy boots now existed in the formal record as a resource that had been found and named and placed in its correct position in the world. That was what documentation did, she thought. It was not the thing itself. The spring was the thing. The paper was the acknowledgement that the thing existed and that it mattered. Both were necessary. Harlan had understood this. He had kept the original surveys, not because a piece of paper was the same as water, but because in the world of human arrangements, paper was how you held onto what you knew was real. She wrote back to Paul and thanked him and asked him to pass her thanks to Rennick as well. She said that she hoped the paper found the audience it deserved. Cass read it too, sitting at the kitchen table in the new house with a glass of juice and the particular focus she brought to things she had decided to understand fully. When she finished, she looked up. They described the spring as a significant regional resource, she said. Yes, Marlene said. And they said the case establishes precedent for similar omitted registrations. That's what Diana said it would do. Cass set the paper down. So other people with strips of land everyone told them were worthless might actually be able to find out if there's something there. That's possible, Marlene said. Cass looked at the paper again with an expression Marlene could not fully read, but recognized as the kind of thinking that went somewhere rather than arriving back where it started. She was 15, and then she would be 16, and then she would be deciding things about her own life with the same watchful intelligence she had brought to all the decisions she had witnessed. And Marlene did not know what she would decide, but believed, with the confidence of someone who had watched carefully for 15 years, that she would cover the full distance before forming her conclusions. That was the thing Harlan had given them both, she thought. Not just the spring, not just the money or the security or the practical changes that followed from a water rights registration upheld in a county proceeding. He had given them the demonstration of what patience and attention and the refusal to abandon a position just because it was inconvenient could actually produce. He had shown them, from 60 years away, that the world contained things worth knowing that required the full walk to find. She thought about writing something down for Cass. Not instructions, not a letter, something more like the stone at the wood line, a marker that pointed. Something that said, "Here is what I learned from a man I barely knew who trusted me with 60 years of quiet knowledge, and the best strip of land anyone ever told me was worthless." She thought she might someday, when she had the words for it. For now, she looked at her daughter reading a hydrology journal paper at the kitchen table in October light, in a house with a furnace that worked, and she thought that some things did not need to be written down because they were already being carried forward in the most reliable way available, in the habits and the attention and the practiced patience of the person sitting across from her. The spring ran. The season turned. The ground held. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything. The grant application came back approved in November, which was not the month she had expected it, and not the month she had been preparing herself for, having learned long ago that the arrival of good things at unexpected moments required a different kind of readiness than the arrival of difficult ones. Difficult things announced themselves with a particular quality of atmosphere, a tightening in the air that gave you time to brace. Good things arrived the way the first warm day of spring arrived, without warning and without apology, and the only reasonable response was to stand still for a moment and let the fact of it register before doing anything else. She stood still in the kitchen with the approval letter on the table in front of her and let it register. The grant was not large by the standards of people who worked with large amounts of money. It was significant by the standards of a woman who had been managing the mathematics of a household on margins that did not forgive mistakes. It was designated for agricultural water infrastructure development, which meant the installation of the access pump and distribution pipe that would connect the spring formally to the surface and make it operational as a supply source rather than simply a registered right. The infrastructure was the bridge between what the spring was on paper and what it would be in practice, and the grant covered 60% of the estimated cost, with a water supply agreement with Gratch covering the remainder through a provision they had negotiated in the final terms specifically for this purpose. Diana called that afternoon, having received her own notification. She said the timing was good and that she had been expecting the approval but had not said so because she had learned over years of practice that telling clients to expect good news before it arrived created a particular kind of disappointment when the good news was delayed that was disproportionate to the delay itself. She said that the next step was engaging a contractor for the infrastructure work, and that she had 2 names to recommend, both of whom had done this kind of installation before, and both of whom she trusted to work with the precision the site required. Marlene wrote the names down and looked at them for a moment. Then she called Paul Oudkirk. He answered on the second ring, and she told him about the grant, and he said that was excellent news and that the timing worked well given the seasonal window for groundwork in this part of the state. She asked him which of the 2 contractors Diana had recommended he would choose, and he said without hesitation the first name on the list, a woman named Kasia Trent, who had done 3 spring-to-surface installations in the region, and whose work he had reviewed on one of them as part of separate hydrological assessment. He said she was thorough and did not cut corners on the ceiling work, which was the part most likely to compromise a clean aquifer source if it was done carelessly. Marlene called Kasia Trent the same afternoon. The conversation had the quality of 2 people who had both done enough preparation to skip the preliminary stages and go directly to the substance. Kasia had already reviewed the hydrological survey, which Paul had apparently sent her in anticipation of exactly this call. She asked 3 specific questions about the site access, the slope gradient at the depression, and the existing fence post placement relative to the projected bore location. Marlene answered 2 of them from memory and said she would verify the third on her next visit to the Fencerow and send the measurement by end of week. There you go, Kasia said. That's all I need to schedule a site visit. They set a date for the following week. Marlene put the phone down and looked at the kitchen window for a moment. Outside, the November afternoon was closing in early the way November afternoons did, the light going from gray to darker gray in the gradual way that announced winter's intentions without yet committing to them fully. The yard of the new house was visible through the window. The vegetable garden beds that the previous tenants had left, turned over now and covered for the season, waiting for spring with the patient blankness of prepared ground. She thought about what it meant to have a plan with actual steps in it. She had had plans before, the ordinary plans of a person managing a complicated present toward a slightly less complicated future, plans built from what was available and aimed at what was possible. Those plans had the character of navigation, finding a way through terrain that was not of your choosing, using what landmarks you could find. This plan was different. This plan was aimed at something she had chosen. It had resources behind it and professionals attached to it, and a timeline that corresponded to a calendar rather than to whatever the next unexpected expense would allow. It was a different feeling. She kept noticing it, the way you notice the absence of a sound you had lived with so long you had stopped hearing it. The low, persistent frequency of financial precarity, the background hum of managing too close to the edge for too long, was quieter now. Not gone. She was not someone who believed that a single change removed all the conditions that had created the difficulty in the first place, but quieter, diminished enough that other thoughts could occupy the space it had been filling. She thought more now, not more words, not more analysis, but more freely, with fewer interruptions from the arithmetic of survival. She found herself thinking about things she had set aside for years without quite deciding to set them aside, ideas that had been parked in the waiting area of her mind with the informal understanding that they would remain there until she had the resources to take them out and look at them properly. She thought about the community center furnace repair that had appeared in the newspaper clipping Harlan had kept, and about the fact that the county had several other public facilities in similar condition, and about what it might look like to apply the same systematic attention she had given to the Fencerow to the question of what was being overlooked in the infrastructure of the place she had lived her whole life. She did not know yet whether that was a direction or just a thought. She gave it space to be either. Kasia Trent's site visit took place on a Tuesday in late November, a cold, clear day when the Fencerow was visible from 50 yards with the kind of clarity that came when the vegetation had died back and the bones of the land showed plainly. Kasia walked the depression section with the practiced eye of someone reading topography the way other people read text, noting things quickly and moving on, stopping twice to take measurements that she entered into a tablet she carried in a padded case. She crouched at the 2 newer fence posts and looked at their placement, and then Kasia looked at Marlene with an expression that contained both professional respect and personal curiosity. Whoever set these posts knew what they were doing, she said. He had a long time to think about it, Marlene said. Kasia looked at the post bases, at the spacing, at the angle of placement relative to the depression's center point. The bore location is almost exactly between them, she said, and the post depth here is different from the others on the line. She had a soil probe with her and pushed it into the ground beside the nearer post. Shallower here, not because the ground is harder, because whoever set them didn't want the post base interfering with the subsurface access corridor. Marlene stood beside her in the November cold. He thought of everything, she said. Kasia pulled the probe and stood. I've done 3 of these installations, she said. I've never had a site that was pre-prepared for the bore location. Usually we spend half a day figuring out the optimal access point. He gave you the optimal access point 70 years ago. He gave me more than he knew how to explain, Marlene said. Kasia looked at the Fencerow for a moment, at the line of old posts extending toward the county road and toward the wood line in opposite directions, at the pale winter grass, at the gray sky above it. Then she looked at Marlene with the directness of someone who had spent her working life in fields and did not traffic in indirection. You know what this is going to mean for the area? She said. Not just your land, the surrounding parcels. A confirmed, viable limestone aquifer source of this yield, with proper infrastructure, registered and operational. This is regional water security in a decade that is going to need it badly. Marlene had thought about this. Not often, not in a way she had spent much time with yet, but she had thought about it. The spring was hers. The water rights were registered in her name. The usage agreement with Gratch governed one practical application of the resource. But the resource itself was larger than any single agreement. It was larger than her. It had been running for 140 years before she found it, and it would run long after she was gone. And what happened with it over that time was partly determined by what she decided now and partly by what the people who came after her decided, and the two were not entirely separable. I know, she said. Kasia nodded once, as if this was the answer she had been checking for. Good, she said. Then let's do this right. The installation was scheduled for the second week of December, weather permitting. Kasia's crew would arrive with a bore rig and the casing materials and the pump assembly and do the work over 2 to 3 days, depending on what the subsurface showed once they broke ground. Paul would be present for the bore to monitor the aquifer response in real time. Rennick had asked to be there for the first pump activation, which Kasia had said was fine and which Marlene had said she was glad about, because she wanted the people who had carried this with her to be present when it became real in the most practical sense. She told Cass on the drive home from the site visit. Cass was in the passenger's seat, which she now occupied with the slightly different quality of 16-year-old than she had at 15, the passenger seat confidence of someone who was beginning to understand her own weight in a room. They're going to put the pump in next month, Marlene said. So the spring becomes actually usable water, Cass said. Yes. Cass looked at the road ahead of them. Actual water that people can use. In an actual drought. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. That's not just about us anymore, she said. No, Marlene agreed. It isn't. Cass looked out the window at the winter fields going past in the last of the afternoon light. She said nothing for a while, but it was the kind of nothing that contained something being worked out rather than the absence of thought. I want to understand how water rights work, she said finally. Like really understand it. The law and the hydrology and the infrastructure. All of it. Marlene glanced at her. Why? Because someone needs to, Cass said simply. And it might as well be someone who grew up understanding why it matters. Marlene looked at her daughter for a moment and then returned her eyes to the road. The fields ran alongside them in the pale winter light, brown and gold and patient, holding themselves in the particular stillness of land between seasons, not ending and not yet beginning, simply present, containing what they contained, waiting for the right conditions to show it. She thought about Harlan Voss keeping a newspaper clipping about a furnace. She thought about what it meant to see something in a person from a long distance, and to act on that seeing in the only way available, quietly and with patience, and with the faith that the right person would eventually come and walk the full length of what you had preserved for them. She thought about Cass at 15 asking, "What did he want you to find?" And At 16, saying someone needs to understand this, and it might as well be someone who grew up knowing why it matters. Some things she thought did not need to be planted. They grew on their own from the ground that had been prepared for them. The ground just had to be the right kind. She pressed her foot gently on the gas and drove them home through the winter fields, through the county she had lived in her whole life, above all the things that lay beneath the surface of it waiting for the right attention to find them, patient and cold and constant, giving themselves without reservation to whoever was willing to walk the full length and look. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you will really enjoy them. And do not forget to subscribe if you have not already. See you in the next story.